And then when I was 30, I was living in upstate Maine. There was a couple years where I was bouncing back and forth between like the Tetons and Jackson Hole and the East Coast. And so I lived in Maine for less than a year. And I woke up in the middle of the night. So I would have been 30 in the winter of 92, 93. I was alone in this house in a very rural part of Maine, and there was a bright light shining through the window, and my bed was pushed right up against the window. So all I had to do was sit up in bed and look out the window, and there was a bright light from a singular light source, shining right into the room, and there were 5 gray beings, the classic skinny gray beings with the bald heads and the big eyes, and they were walking toward the house. Now, I was the only one in the house. I should have panicked, right? And by all accounts, I should have jumped out of bed and locked the door and, grabbed a baseball bat and anything. But I didn't. I heard a very calm voice in my mind. And I struggle with this because it could have been my own voice, but a very calm voice in my mind said,
had no idea you did the cover for Mac Tonnies.
I didn't do the cover. I did the interior work. The cover was.
You did the interior work.
The cover was done by a woman named Dia Sobin.
That's so funny because I've had this book forever, and it's one of my favorites, and it's just another weird synchronicity.
There's a story about there's an image of Mac. This is a weird thing. How much do you know about Mac Tonnies?
Not a lot.
Just a second.
I mean, I've read his book, and I've looked into him a little bit.
Hold on. I don't know if you can see that or not.
Yeah.
Do you know what that is?
Leather jacket?
After Mac died, his mom sent me his leather jacket. It fits me perfectly.
Tell me about Mac. What was he like?
He was great. He was great. He was amazing. Yeah. And so I was very, very, this would have been, he died in 2009.
How did he die?
He died from an undiagnosed heart condition. And, he had been to the hospital and I talked to him and he had passed out at work, which was at the Starbucks. And then he went for a bunch of testing. And there's pictures on his blog of him doing these testings where he's walking on the treadmill with an oxygen, regulating thing that could monitor his oxygen levels. And then a couple of months later, he just died in his sleep. And he had now I might have this wrong and I've talked but I think I'm pretty close. He had a 3-ring binder on his desk with the final edits. The book was printed out with the final edits and his red pen markings and stuff in the book. It sounds like, according to the publisher, there was a little bit more editing and they had to do it without his consent, obviously, but there was a crew of writers that really cared about him that all sort of chimed in. And so what's in that book, I think, is a real testament to his friends and to the people who, because Nick Redfern and Greg Bishop did a forward and afterword and such. So, and the audiobook is quite good of that book too. So whoever read the audiobook did a great job. It's
not a thick book, but it's so dense with material and there's so much there to absorb. It's one of the most compelling books on the phenomenon that I've ever read.
It's funny because he wasn't wedded to that idea. He was kind of doing audio interviews about the idea and he was a little bit tired of it by the time he finished the book. And, he had finished the book and was publishing little essays on his blog. Some of the stuff in the book itself are blog posts. The initial cat thing with the cat and the string. Or excuse me, the cat and the laser pointer his blog was really early on in the era of blogging. So he was right there at the forefront of this stuff. But we used to talk late at night and I was shook up at that chapter of my life. So he was basically my therapist in a lot of ways. And he was great. It was what I needed. He had no patience or sympathy for me whining. He would just say, wow, that's really interesting. And then would explore it like that. And he never, which I had friends and stuff like that could go oh, Mike, it sounds like you're going through a really hard time, which I was. But it's really refreshing to have someone who was just totally focused on the core mystery and recognized the mystery for what it was, like a genuine mystery, and just engaged it from that level, right from the first hello we had on the phone. There was a podcast, I think it's still on. It's kind of long in the tooth at this point, but it's called Banal of America. I think in 2007, he did it. That's almost 20 years ago. He did a podcast on Banal of America and the host Tim Banal. And it was a 4-hour thing. It was two-hour segments. And it was great. I must have listened to it 10 times. And this was back when I just called him up. I called up St. Louis, Missouri, just, called the operator and said, can you give me the phone number for Mac Tonnies? And they did. And I just called him up out of the blue and left a message and he got right back to me. And it was so right away, we were just gabbing for hours.
So you kicked off a friendship immediately. Now, at this point, what period in your life was this?
This would have been around 2007.
2007.
So I don't know how much you know. I mean, so I do a lot of podcasts and I've written books and I've told a lot of these stories over and over again. And so I'm totally, absolutely content to just tell you whatever you need to hear. In 2006, I had an experience that doesn't seem like much on the surface, but it totally changed the direction of my life. I'm happy to tell that if you want.
Well, why don't we start there? Why don't we start with who you are? I'm aware of you and I'm aware of your work because I've had some very weird, unique experiences of my own. And it's just one of those synchronicities, I guess, that we came into contact when we did. But for people who don't know your background and what got you into ufology as a subject, can you just bring them up to speed first and then we can take it from there?
Okay, so I'm 62 now, and in 2006 I was 44. That's right, and I had an event which I'll talk about. But leading up to that, I had a handful of events as a boy and a young man. So as a 12-year-old, I had a missing time event, which is kind of an interesting story. And then I had a close-up, what I felt like it was a close-up UFO sighting. It felt like something out a window. I was with another person and I drew a picture of it at the time. I still have the picture. And then when I was 30, now this one's a little harder to sort of brush under the rug. When I was 30, I woke up. I was actually reading Bud Hopkins' books, a Bud Hopkins book, Intruders, and it was on my nightstand. And so believe me, like I factored that in. Like, was my subconscious just spinning with this imagery? And
did you lose sleep over that? I've lost sleep over Bud Hopkins' books.
I worked with Bud, and I knew Bud pretty well at the end there. You know what? It's funny because people do this. People say like, "Weren't you? Like this book is terrifying," and I was like, "Yeah, I don't see it as terrifying. It's really interesting." And it's like, so I right from the beginning, I felt like I was looking at the UFO contact experience and the lore of it as a form of modern mythology. And this is where Mac was great, where he really recognized that this overstory had seeped into our collective unconscious in a way that had become a form of our mythology, or let's say folklore. It's a modern folklore. And you can't separate it. I mean, like, you know, every snowboarder's got a sticker on their Subaru of a gray alien, you know, so it's ubiquitous in our cultures. But as far as scary, I had some really scary experiences. Those didn't happen until 2010. I had one really scary experience. I'm happy to talk about that.
Well, just a quick second here, because you mentioned that you had a missing time experience at 12.
I know
and then when you're in your 30s, you're in New York working with Bud Hopkins. There's a thread here. Can you tease that out?
Okay, so I'll give you my little timeline of my life here because it jumps around a bunch. So I grew up in Michigan in the suburbs of Detroit. And then when I was 19, I moved to New York City and went to NYU for 1 year. I studied film at NYU and dropped out promptly. I had worked at an ad agency. I rode my bike to an ad agency when I was 16, I think. And so I had like a skill, like to work at a job. So when I got to New York, I was like, I could either stay in school or I could work. And so I ended up dropping out so I could work in ad agencies. And for the next 10 years, I did illustration work in ad agencies. This was the 80s, 81 to 91. This was like the go-go 80s this is the birth of Donald Trump, basically, in the zeitgeist of America. So I was right there when all that was happening in the New York Post and everything. So, and then I wanted to move out west to be a ski bum for 1 year. And that turned into 25 years. So in 91, I moved out west and kind of never came back. And then I lived in upstate New York for a short period, just a couple years ago. But so when I was 30, so the stuff happened when I was a boy. I have a missing time event and a close-up UFO sighting. So I consequently started reading books on the subject. And so as a very young kid, like I had this experience and I could always just say, like, you'd read some outlandish, or let's say hard to believe, difficult to believe story, you know, of someone seeing a UFO or someone's experiences. And I found it was very difficult to dismiss it out of hand because it's like, well, I had an experience or a set of experiences I simply cannot explain. So I was very open to the lore, the books and stuff. So at a certain point around 1992, I started compulsively reading UFO books, sort of obsessively, which is kind of a clue in some ways. And then when I was 30, I was living in upstate Maine. There was a couple years where I was bouncing back and forth between like the Tetons and Jackson Hole and the East Coast. And so I lived in Maine for less than a year. And I woke up in the middle of the night. So I would have been 30 in the winter of 92, 93. I was alone in this house in a very rural part of Maine. And there was a bright light shining through the window. And my bed was pushed right up against the window. So all I had to do was sit up in bed and look out the window. And there was a bright light from a singular light source, shining right into the room. And there were 5 gray beings, the classic skinny gray beings with the bald heads and the big eyes. And they were walking toward the house. Now I was the only one in the house, and so I should have panicked, right? And by all accounts, I should have like jumped out of bed and locked the door and, grabbed a baseball bat and anything. But I didn't. I heard a very calm voice in my mind. And I struggle with this because it could have been my own voice, but a very calm voice in my mind said, "Yes, they're here. Now is the time to put your head on the pillow and shut down." And that's exactly what I did. And so seeing these beings walking towards the house, maybe 30 seconds, maybe less. Oddly, I remember I was much more interested in the bright light behind them, which is a weird thing. And then, and I've tried to describe this to people. There was a distorted sense of reality itself. I used to say it was dream-like, but that's not quite true. Excuse me, I used to say it was a dream, but that's not quite true. It was dream-like. In its intensity, in its strangeness, and it was weirdly quiet, and my thoughts were eerily clear. And unlike a dream, if I have dreams, I'm very well aware of my dream landscapes. They're mixed up and distorted. And if I was in a house like the house I grew up in, it would be mixed up. It wouldn't match the house itself. This matched the room exactly. So everything about it felt like reality in that sense. But there was this distorted sense of reality. I can get back to that because that's something I've focused a lot on in the after years. So the next morning I got up, and this would have been wintertime, and I never even bothered to go out and see if there were footprints in the snow. And I did have a hypnosis session with Bud Hopkins where we looked into that one event, and very, very little came up that I hadn't remembered consciously. So, wow, did I just like push that out of my mind. Like, no way, not gonna take this seriously. It couldn't happen to me. And as I said before, I had a book on my nightstand with Bud Hopkins' Intruders, which is the scary one, the scariest one. That's the story of Deb Cobble. And I just dismissed it as just, I confabulated it out of my own just obsessive reading on the subject. I no longer feel that way. I feel like something genuine happened that night. What it might be, I could certainly speculate, but I don't know.
If you had to speculate, what do you think it was?
So I've had this conversation with people who've had the experience. And so this is when I saw those beings outside the window. I did a detailed illustration. It's on my website, and it's in one of the books. I think it's in 2 of the books. And they were coming towards the house. And it was like, so when I did the hypnosis session with Bud, it was essentially, he just gave me permission in that hypnotic state, which is very strange. And I'm very cautious to trust the stuff that emerges through hypnosis. But what it felt like, I was seeing relatives, like those kind of relatives you only see once in a while. And it felt like I was watching him walk towards the house, like, let's say, as a 12-year-old at Thanksgiving, where I was like, and my very clear thought was, which I never had the nerve to articulate to myself until I vocalized it in the hypnosis session. And it was sort of like, oh, it's them, they're back. It's them again. They're here again. The same way, and it was very calm. It was like relatives coming for Thanksgiving dinner. It was like, oh, they're back again. So, and I've told that to people who've had the experience, and they are like, ooh, like, I understand what that means. So that's something that is shared with the people who have this experience, that familiarity with these things in the moment.
It feels like that happens so frequently. Like, so many of these stories wind up going in that direction. I was just talking the other day. I had watched an interview with Chris Bledsoe on his son's podcast, and I'm very interested in his case just because of how wild it is. But then I listened to a transcript of a hypnotic regression that he did. And he said almost verbatim what you just said. He was like, oh, they're here. They've been with me since before I was born. They're here with me now. I think that this is one of the most frustrating things about our community and the people who find themselves in it, is this sort of give and take between this idea of nuts and bolts reality and some kind of high strangeness reality that we just can't quite ever get a grip on. And it seems so ethereal, but yet also omnipresent, and it seems very consistent from person to person to person. So there's some kind of reality there, but it's just hard to understand it. Where do you fall on this spectrum? And over time, how has that view evolved for you, given your own personal experiences?
Well, I guess as a boy, I would have been looking into or I treated it as a nuts and bolts phenomenon, right? So this would have been the age of Leonard Nimoy In Search Of and things like that. And so there were a lot of UFO books that were around as a boy. I never really read anything meaningful until I guess I read one or two, but as I said before, I got obsessed at a certain point. But one of the first books I read series of books I read was Communion by Whitley Strieber. And then there's a trilogy of books by Jacques Vallée, Revelations, Confrontations, and Dimensions. And I read all three of those, boom, boom, boom. So I was primed to see this as something more ethereal and something that interfaces with human consciousness differently than, let's say, a nuts and bolts metal flying saucer from another planet. So I've been on this odyssey for that's 30 years ago since the event 32 years ago since the event in Maine. I would ask people, I'm merciless. I'm like, if I want to talk to someone, I'm going to find a way to talk to them. So I talk to people all the time. And now people are reaching out to me to talk to me. So I depend on this dialogue to make sure that I recognize that I'm not alone in this. And so I would ask people, hey, have you ever had like this weird, odd, distorted feeling, like in a contact setting? And not everyone, many of the people who've had these experiences will then go on to describe this sort of distorted sense of reality. And I talked to one woman she was driving a convertible in Los Angeles on the freeway. And for some reason, the traffic had slowed and she was going very slow. And essentially a UFO a flying saucer hovered right above her car. She feels like there was an abduction event that took place where it plucked her out of time and dropped her back in the car and such. But she, without any prompting from me, said, when I was in the presence of that craft directly above my car, she said, when you take two magnets and you hold them and they go click and they snap together, and then you pull them apart and you turn one of them 180 degrees and then but they won't go together. Now they're repelling each other. So you push and push and push and try to push them together. And in between the magnets, there's nothing to see. There's nothing at all to see, but you can feel and sense this sort of warbly, pressurized energy as you try to push these things and they repel. And she said, that's what it was like being in the presence of that craft. It was like being between the magnets.
Welcome back to The Night Shift, your safe space for talking about UFOs, UAPs, NHI, disclosure, and everything else your friends, family, and coworkers are so sick and tired of hearing you go on and on and on about. Listen, the next time you're met with a 1,000-yard stare, a blank expression, don't get mad, just take a beat, stand up, turn around, and walk away. Because you don't need those people. You just need to believe in yourself and in them. Because they're real, and apparently they're here. But what do they want? And how is it going to affect you and me? These are the questions we explore here at Night Shift. We're not so much a podcast, we're more of a support group for wayward UFO enthusiasts. Somewhere between In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy and that show where Jonathan Frakes rides in on a bicycle and asks a bunch of weird questions.
Ever gone mountain biking?
What do you want to be when you grow up?
What's the right tip?
I don't know, we're still working out the beats on this thing. But listen, if you've fallen down the UFO rabbit hole and you're just as lost and confused and disoriented as the rest of us, what you need is a guide, and we are that guide. So take me by the hand and hit that subscribe button. And while you're at it, don't forget to like and share this video. It's a heavy lift to build this channel from scratch, and I could use all the help I could get. Thanks in advance for being a part of Team Night Shift and the most exciting conversation happening anywhere on planet Earth.
The study of UFOs in many ways is in the hands of wannabe engineers and things like that who want to study the craft and study the sighting reports and talk to make phone calls to control towers at airports to see if they got any radar returns and things like that. Very, very pragmatic things, which is an important part of the whole subject, but it's not the only part. And I've talked to UFO researchers and I'm like, well, do you look into the abduction stuff? And they're like, no, I don't like to do that because it's just so messy. People are talking about emotions and feelings. And I don't want to dirty my hands with that stuff. And then, so on the other side of the spectrum, you go to, let's say, a UFO conference. This is a caricature, but it's kind of true. There's a bunch of guys on one half of the room and they've got their briefcases and they've got all these government documents and they've got, their reports and the data they can look at. And then there's all these women on the other side and they've got their turquoise earrings and their flowy linen dresses and they're talking about channeling and psychic abilities and healing abilities and premonitions and so they're talking there. It is two entirely different camps and they don't overlap much. And I've sat with the nuts and bolts researchers. Like you get them at the bar at a UFO conference and you get a couple glasses of wine into them and you're like, hey, like, what about the weird stuff? You're going to go like, do you ever have any? And they roll their eyes and they're like, oh my God, the weird stuff. I know all about the weird stuff. But I want to be taken seriously as a researcher. So I'm not going there. I'm not going to include that. I'm not going to share any of those stories. They'll tell you privately and they're just the same stories everyone else is telling, but they're not saying it publicly. So,
do you get the sense that is shifting now? Because it seems like, especially recently with Jake Barber's interview on Ross Coulthard, did you watch that whole long form interview where he talks about telepathically connecting with one of the craft he was transporting and he describes the experience of that and what it felt like? And you have this guy who's a, tough as nails, military, Air Force, Special Forces pilot who's seen it all, and he chokes up and almost visibly cries on camera. He's teary-eyed when he goes back to that memory. And I wonder if that's maybe representative of a larger shift and bringing these two things together. Do you see that shifting at any time, or has it always kind of been right down the middle, split like that?
I think it ebbs and flows. I think it ebbs and flows back and forth. What I can say is that the 2017 New York Times article shifted the pop culture way we frame this, shifted it very much towards the nuts and bolts. So since 2017, 60 Minutes did an interview with the two jet pilots from the Nimitz. And boy, they weren't talking about being psychic or having healing abilities or any of that stuff. They were talking about, pragmatic, the craft was moving in ways that we can't repeat with our present day human technology and things like that. So it was very much, so what I can say is that in the last almost 10 years, the last 8 years, that we've been the pop culture, the stuff that makes it to TV and 60 Minutes and stuff like that is all about the nuts and bolts stuff. And then the subculture, the podcasts and the blogs and the books that people are putting out, wow, is that the grassroots down low are just swimming in this aspect. Some people call it consciousness, the consciousness aspect. Some people call it love and light. That's kind of so nuts and bolts and love and light are the two terms I use to define the two ends of the continuum. And I'm like, I drew cartoons for a living for most of my life. So I'm totally open to these caricatures.
I think it's, there's an obvious utility to focusing on nuts and bolts from the standpoint of if you're trying to get the government to react and to bring forward some information, you have to make the case and build it on something real. So I can see that, but you're so right. Especially in our little community here at my channel, the people that are flooding into this space right now are flooding in because they're having one-on-one personal experiences that they can't explain and they can't square it with anything else. And they don't know what to do with it. And one of the kind of the jokes on our show is that it's a safe space to kind of talk about that with other people who know what you're talking about. Can you talk to the people who haven't experienced anything like this in the past and explain a little bit about what high strangeness is and how it kind of relates to the big picture of ufology in general?
So on the simplest level, there's people who have these experiences will be at the receiving end of highly charged, powerful synchronicities. And this is consistent. And this is one of the questions I used to ask. I don't bother asking it anymore because I know the answer I'm going to get every single time. So people involved in this, I'm like, so like, you have any synchronicities in your life? And they kind of like, they look like you slapped them in the face. They're so like, oh my God, I can't even begin to describe what's been going on in my life. So you get these, what amount to synchronicity is not even the right word. It feels like orchestrated events are laid in their path in ways that they cannot deny. And so whether that's synchronicities or whether it's seemingly orchestrated events, orchestrated relationships show up a lot in this field. People become psychic, very common. People see a UFO and become psychic. People get healing abilities, and then people get a sense of mission. This is totally understood. It's been well understood for 30 years that people will have a powerful sense of mission that they can't point to. So in many ways, the UFO contact experience overlaps with the near-death experience. People come back from, someone dies on the operating table during heart surgery, they're revived, they're gone for 2 minutes, they may tell a story that lasts 5 years in their netherworld, and then they come back and they're psychic, they have healing abilities, they have a sense of mission, they find they integrate very poorly with the rest of the world. There's a term used in near-death experience research, which is the trauma of enlightenment. And I'm not saying that people who have UFO contact are enlightened, but they have been directly confronted with something that our collective society says cannot happen, right?
So seeing a larger reality and becoming aware of it, and then kind of coming back to the 9 to 5 grind or whatever you want to call it of regular workaday life is so difficult that they have a hard time reacclimating. Is that kind of the idea?
Sure. Yeah. I think both the near-death experiencer and the UFO contactee or experiencer or whatever, abductee or whatever term, vocabulary word you want to use. Yeah, I would say. And then both of them are murky and both of them are messy. It's tough to research either one of them because the stories are wildly divergent and from experiencer to experiencer, whether there's a whole library of events that can take place in either a near-death experience or a contact experience. Some people have terrible, nightmarish experiences. Some people have loving, blissful, angelic experiences.
It seems to me like, especially since 2017, space has gotten much bigger. More people are aware of it. It's destigmatized in a large way. And it feels like there's something in the air. Do you get that sense that something is motivating all of this? Or are we just in a cultural moment where UFOs are having their thing and this is just taking off?
People who are new to the subject, and this was me at a certain point, this would have been me around the time of 2006, 2007. There's a sense of urgency. When you dip your toe into this thing and all of a sudden you realize it's like, oh, this is real. There's so much more than I thought there was. Alan Hynek, when confronted with, this is going back to these reporters, and would say, where's your evidence? And he was like, where do I back up the truck? Like, well, I got more evidence. We're drowning in evidence. No one wants to look at it. So when people realize there's this wealth of information, and it's not just little dots in the sky, and it's not just burn marks in a farmer's yard, it's the weird stuff too, alongside it. It's all in the same. So when people are new to this, they're just slammed with this sense of urgency, this sense of like, oh my gosh, this is the most important, powerful story that ever in the human history. And like, what do I do? What do I do? And then they put out a blog post and no one pays any attention, or they make some YouTube interview and like it gets 20 hits and not. So there's loneliness almost. And I will say that the advent of the internet has changed a lot of things, where Whitley Strieber, for instance, came out with his book in 1987 and was vilified in the press and was a laughingstock for years. At the same time, the book was wildly popular, amazingly popular, sold millions, and it changed the way we define what we would call UFO experiences. And then I came along and started talking publicly about my experiences around 2009, and I wrote a big fat book 9 years ago, and a few more since then. I have had no pushback, essentially zero. I've caught a few there's like a thing maybe on a YouTube thread or something like that where someone says, but essentially zero pushback. People privately, maybe talking behind my back, no one has confronted me publicly in any meaningful way.
I got the sense that a lot of the media pushback that happened in the 90s was orchestrated or was intentional for the sake of stigmatizing the topic. Particularly, I'm thinking about like Bud Hopkins' appearances on talk shows and stuff, where you go back, if you watch those clips now, it's embarrassing the way that they were treated. And those guests who were basically pouring their hearts out and being very upfront with these really personal things. And it was sort of like, there's one clip where Oprah kind of just laughs everything off, and she just thinks it's all such a silly thing. And maybe that's lifting. Maybe that's
definitely changing. That's definitely changing.
Yeah.
So, for instance, there was a sort of understood need. Well, think about it. So, to make a documentary 30 years ago, you would have had to have made the documentary with a lot of money. Someone would have to give you money. Now you can do it on your Mac for almost nothing. And to have it be put on TV, you would have to have it. You're required to have a counterpoint. If you're making your point, you would have to have someone counterpoint that, and that's not happening now. Kelly Chase, did you see her 3-part documentary that she put out called Cosmosis?
Cosmosis, yeah.
So that third episode was all about the consciousness aspect, and there was no dissenting voice saying like, oh, it was just the people talking about their direct experiences. They were very cautious to say, like when they were speculating, they were very clear when they were speculating. And when a witness was telling their firsthand experiences, that I feel that witnesses were being entirely genuine. And so, yeah, we're in a different era of how information flows around than it was 30 years ago.
It definitely feels like the tone now of most of these conversations starts from a place of, we're taking this as a reality and we're going to begin there. And now we're going to try to understand what's going on. I feel like that's the thing that seems to have changed the most. Back to Bud and John Mack and some of the other abduction research, I just was thinking about something you said a moment ago. People have this sense of mission. You know how it was discussed a lot with people who were claimed to be abductees or contactees, that they were given something to do. They were given a task. I think there's a story that, was it Bud Hopkins who said the story about the big screen? And there's a room full of people, all abductees. They're all in a craft. They're looking at this giant screen, like a movie screen, and they're seeing scenes play out from them. And they're being told, like, you're going to have a job to do, and you're going to know what it is when it's time to do it. But until then, you're not going to know. And these people come back and they just have no clue what this is all about. Is that tied to this sense of mission that you described, that people seem to be like activated, almost like, I think Kelly Chase once told me in a conversation, she's like, it's like a sleeper agent. You get like switched on and your assignment is to just start doing UFO stuff. Is there a connection there? What do you think?
So I would. So no, it's not a big question for me, because it's totally like I fall into that 1,000%. Like the genesis of the books, where I was in my life. It's a little bit of a long story, and I think I would be leapfrogging over the middle to. So I can tell you the story, but I don't want to tell it at the beginning of the interview here because it's too.
We'll come back to it.
So yes, the sense of mission, the sense that, so it gets weirder than that. It's like, it is that some part of their consciousness, and this is so funny. I was on a big Zoom call, and it was with some friends. And then it was also with people who were part of a podcast. I don't want to say which podcast it was. And then I shared essentially exactly what you're talking about with my own direct experience. I've been very open about it. It's in my book. One of my books. And then I kind of told the story basically that people feel that they lived a previous existence as something else, whether that was as a gray alien or like just an amorphic blob of energetic consciousness. And somehow they reincarnated here into this life and had the switched on activation where all of a sudden that consciousness came back and said, now is the time for the hard work. And I told this, you got the big Brady Bunch screen where there's like 20 people all, and I told this, and it was like the number of people that just nodded as I was describing this. Wasn't everyone, but wow, it was enough to say that this is something that is well understood. John Mack's book, which came out in 99, I think, Abduction, that was the very first book that felt like it formally talked about that in a grounded way. There's a term called starseed. You go to Sedona and you're having your salad at the vegetarian restaurant, and everyone in the room is talking about like, oh, I'm a starseed, or my son's a starseed. And so it's an easy thing to caricature, but that's exactly what they're saying, that they came here for some reason. Did you read American Cosmic by Diana Pasulka?
Yes.
The character of Tyler D would fall into that, where he's going through a sort of ritual. I mean, it's simple. I mean, he talks about drinking lots of water and getting up and looking at this, going out and taking a walk in the sunshine in the morning and getting lots of sleep. So his good, clean living is kind of his mantra. And then he is flooded with these almost like, I'm going to be very cautious because I don't want to put words into his mouth. And that book was very cautiously phrased. The text of that was very cautious. I feel like I could kind of read between the lines, so what was implied, and I'm saying this cautiously because I don't really truly know what was in, but that Tyler D was channeling or was given downloads or had set himself up in a way to receive these cosmic messages and then had done good work for healing through his patented inventions and patented ideas for healing, for helping people. So what I'm finding is it's not that people are like, I guess, like if it was like, if you were in the French Resistance and you were behind the lines in France, you would have been blowing up bridges and cutting, telephone lines and stabbing Nazis in the alleys. But what people are talking about now, this sort of fifth column, they're talking about, I'm become a shaman. I have healing abilities. I've started channeling. I'm doing psychic sessions and helping people become their best selves. That's what's emerging. And I'm sure there's a big wide range of it. And by me saying that, you can tell the kind of people who are reaching out to me with their owl stories. When
your book, The Messengers, was released and I saw the cover, it struck me. And I had seen you speak in different podcasts and things online a little bit. You've got such an interesting story here. Can you explain what the connection is for you and how this became sort of your focus?
Yeah. I'm obsessed. So, and I'm open with that. I've been pulling on this owl thread for 15 years now. If it wasn't interesting and it didn't continue to be interesting, I would just drop it and walk away. But it has remained just remarkably, powerfully engaging and interesting. In 2006, I was living in a little town in Idaho, right on the edge of Grand Teton National Park. I was working for an outdoor school. I was spending my summers teaching mountaineering in Alaska and then my winters teaching winter camping in and around the Rockies. Well, it was an idyllic life. I kind of aged myself out of it. But I got back from Alaska. It was autumn. There was a young woman that lived in the town I was living in, and she had been there all summer long. And I just got in a conversation, total stranger. And she said, I've been here all summer. And I'm like, wow, you must have camped all summer with the Tetons right in the backyard and Yellowstone right here. She said, I didn't camp once. And I said, that's terrible. I'll take you camping. So I'm a professional camper. I teach people how to camp. So I said, let's go camping. So we went out with a very light pack for one night, and it was a beautiful weather. The weather forecast in that part of the Northern Rockies was, you can just look to the sky to the southeast and you just know that it's going to be clear all night. So we didn't take a tent. So we walked into the Tetons, which is one of the most beautiful places on earth. And we got with a light pack starting at lunchtime. We walked in, and by early evening, we were way deep in the mountains. And I was sitting on a flat rock with this woman. Her name is Kristen. Now, to tell this story properly, there's some key details I got to share. She was a stranger. It's like a first date. I've told this to people before, and they're like, you took someone camping on a first date? And it's like, it's kind of camping culture in that kind of place. It would be like living in Hawaii and going surfing on a first date, So, but I was sitting on this flat rock. I was making dinner. We were in this field of wildflowers. The sun was setting, and she was saying something. So this was a stranger, and I was like, oh my word, this woman is smarter. She has more depth, more insightful than I ever would have guessed. Like, I was really struck. Like, wow, I'm sharing this powerful moment. She's sharing. And at that moment, an owl flew over, and then a second owl, and then a third owl. And for the next couple of hours, as the sun set and the stars came out, these three owls flew around us, landed on branches near us, swooped down above us. And we were in bear country, so we just cleaned up our kitchen, walked for another half a mile or so. The owls followed us. They flew right alongside of us and landed on trees. And we got to a pretty spot to sleep. We didn't have a tent, so we just laid our sleeping bags down on the ground and looked up at the stars. And so we're lying on the ground. And so if owls are very quiet in flight. So the stars are magnificent in that part of the Rockies. And the owls would swoop right close to our faces, and you could just almost feel them pass in front of your face. And the stars would be blotted out for just a microsecond. It was so powerful. And the next morning we were like, wow, that was something. Wow, that was something. And I said, let's go camping again. Let's go camping again. She said, great. So 4 days later, we went to a different part of the mountains. This time it was a little colder. And there was a hilltop near, we had a tent. So we set the tent up and there was a hilltop. And I said, let's walk to the top of that hill and watch the sunset. And we'll warm up the act of walking up the hill and walking back to the tent. Because you don't want to climb in the tent when you're kind of standing around chilled. So walk to the top of the hill, watch the sunset. And as the sun is setting, 3 owls fly around us. 4 days later, same person, different part of the mountains. I'm convinced these were the same 3 owls. I have no way to prove that, but they were short-eared owls. They're about 11 inches tall. They're cute. Like these adorable little owls are, before they kind of stayed off in the distance. These owls were landing at our feet. I can so clearly see Kristen's face. She was just in this place of astonishment. And to have it happen once was pretty cool. To have it happen twice was positively mystical. Kristen moved out of the valley. She moved back to Michigan where she grew up. And she and I kept in touch. And I've started a blog in 2009. So that's 3 years later. So 3 years later, I started a blog. So what was happening, I talked a little bit about the experiences I had as a 12-year-old boy. And then I had been reading UFO books. When I saw those 3 owls, 2 separate occasions, 4 days apart, both times I had a very clear thought in my head. And I was saying to myself, this has something to do with the UFOs. Whether that was my voice or like a projected voice, I wish I could answer that clearly, but there was a very clear voice. This has something to do with UFOs. There's no UFOs, just owls.
Yeah.
And what it did is it forced me, 2 things happened. Afterwards, I started looking into owls. Kristen and I were both like, this is early on in the age of Google, and we were looking up spirit meaning of owls and folklore stories about owls and mythology of owls. And it was really fruitful. Like it was really interesting, the stuff that was coming up. And then also I started looking into my own experiences. I reached out to MUFON and I reached out to Leo Sprinkle, who was a researcher who lived in Laramie, Wyoming, which is not too close to where I was living, but it's by Western standards, not too bad. And he was a researcher that he died a couple of years ago, but he was at the forefront of so much that was going on in the UFO contact world from the 60s right up until the time of his death. Now, I also started a blog in 2009. And the very first blog post was called The Cat and String, which is before I met Mac Tonnies. And it was almost the same blog post he put up. We actually figured it out that it was like a little over a month apart. We both essentially wrote the same essay about cats and UFOs. I did it with a string. He did it with a laser pointer, but we definitely wrote the same, seemingly a very similar. You can't read both essays side by side without realizing that they're almost the same. So that was my first blog post. The second blog post was the story of Kristen that I just told here, including the part where I said she was talking about something powerful at the time. So I contacted her. I called her up. She's in Michigan. I called her up. Kristen, what were we talking about that first night when we saw the very first owls? I remember we were talking about something and it felt so important at the time. What was it? And she said, oh, I remember exactly what we were talking about. She said, I was giving my deepest, most heartfelt definition of what God means to me. So like, I'm not at all churchy, and that's in the sense that like the idea of God, like I don't have like a religious background to that doesn't mean much to me, but I certainly recognized the mythic power of that statement. And so right from the beginning, I was looking at UFOs, owls, and this mythic power between them right from the very beginning. And so I started looking into my contact experiences. I was complete denial for years. And then but I was reaching out to people and like Leo Sprinkle would say, here's a person you should call. He gave me a phone number. I'd call him and we'd talk. And then I would ask everyone, and I still do, I ask everyone, have you ever had any odd experiences with owls? And right from the beginning, I was hearing the strangest stories. People would say that no one has ever asked me that story. I have got the weirdest story of an owl. So starting around 2009, was putting these stories on my blog, including my own stories, which I have a lot of. And then initially, I didn't want to put the UFO stuff on the blog, but I felt like things just forced me to put my own struggling with what my experiences may or may not be in this public forum on a blog. 2009 doesn't seem like that long ago, but it was a different era of blogging where I just am so astonished that I would be so public with this stuff in a forum like that. But I put on the edge of my blog, I want to hear your owl stories. So right from the beginning, I started receiving owl stories, and they started as a trickle, and then it turned into, it has been a torrent for the last decade.
Do you think that a skeptic would hear that story and say, well, you were out in the wilderness, you saw owls, and maybe you were thinking about whatever at the time, but aren't you just connecting to unrelated things that how do you answer someone like that who maybe not understand the significance of this?
Well, I mean, isn't a poet take disparate things, takes the birds and the trees and the sunrise and puts it into something meaningful? I mean, isn't that the role of us as humans? I'm not trying, as I said, I'm not a scientist. I'm not beholden to I'm telling a story. This is my story. Too bad. It's not my job to make the skeptic happy. I don't waste a second trying to make the skeptic happy. I do try to be very formal in, let's say, my journalistic ethics, right? So if I quote someone, I want to quote them exactly. And if I speculate, I say I'm speculating. This is something I learned from Mac Tonnies. Mac Tonnies did this beautifully. If he was speculating, he would say, well, now I'm going to speculate. And he would talk and riff, and the whole book, The Cryptoterrestrials, is sort of a meditation on exactly that. And then when he's done, he says, now I'm done speculating. If we're talking about facts, you can say, oh, this is a fact. It is a fact that Kristen said she was giving her deepest, most heartfelt definition of God. That's a fact.
That's very interesting to me for a few reasons. I think I'm reminded of a story that I read, and I want to say it was in Abduction, or I don't remember which story this was, but I'm sure this will ring a bell for you. It was a contactee, or it was an abductee who was a little girl who was out in a camping, I believe, or having a picnic with her family, and wanders into the woods, and she's gone for what she thinks is 5 minutes, 6 minutes. And she goes into the woods and she sees a deer. This beautiful, do you know the story I'm talking about?
This is very common, but keep going.
Beautiful deer, the most beautiful moment. The sunlight's coming down. It's all just this gorgeous cinematic moment. And then she goes back to her family, and it's been 3 hours, and they're frantic and they don't know where she was, and she's panicking. You're talking specifically about owls, but I've heard many stories that involve some kind of a beautiful animal of a different nature, maybe appearing and suddenly just being there in a very close, intimate way that's kind of difficult to explain any other time. Are owls unique, or is this part of a larger tableau of other animal experiences that are also tied into the phenomenon? Okay,
so there's two things that are going on. So you're talking about the screen memory aspect.
Yes.
So that's a term that was used by Bud Hopkins and a whole list of. So you talk to the UFO researcher, the abduction researcher, and you say, "Hey, you have any stories of owls showing up in your reports?" And they roll their eyes and they show up all the time. We get them all the time. They're screen memories. So the typical screen memory would be here. I'll tell a story. So a guy that I'm at a UFO conference. This is real early on, and this guy it's like they have a UFO abductee support group meeting, and I sat in on it. I was at a point when I was totally denying anything, but there I was in the meeting. So, and they sit in a circle. It's kind of like an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, and someone raised their hand and said, here's my experience. And they tell the story. And there's this guy kind of off in the corner, and he's really tense. You can tell he's tied in knots. And at the very end, he kind of raises his hand and says, hey, has anyone here had any odd experiences with owls? And this guy almost fell out of his chair when everyone in the room raised their hand. And not everyone, but seemingly everyone, including me, raised their hand. And so he told his story, and he was driving down a lonely road at night, and there was a big owl on the side of the road, tall, 3.5 foot tall, 4 foot tall. And he rolls his window down, pulls right up to it, and it's standing on the side of the road. So it's looking right at him through the window. And he gets this really bad feeling and leaves. And later he was taking photographs. He's a photographer, and there was an owl nest, and it's in a tree, and he's taking pictures of these owls. And he thinks to himself, I don't think that was an owl I saw that night. So he went through hypnotic regression, and essentially nothing turned up except the owl was wearing boots. So now let me tell you, it's a 4 foot tall owl. There is no such thing as a 4 foot tall owl. They simply do not get that big. Maybe way off in the distance. If you're trying to measure the height, you might guess 4 foot tall, but there's no owl on Earth that can stand on the road and look at the driver of a car through the roll down window, unless you're kind of looking down and the owl's looking up. So here, that's the screen memory. So the implication is under hypnosis, and I've talked to a lot of hypnotherapists who do this work, and I feel like, and I've read the transcripts, and the hypnotherapist will say, so describe this owl you're seeing in the road. And the person will say, well, it's got a bald head and big black eyes, and it's got this tight-fitting, shiny spacesuit on, and it's really, really skinny, and I don't think that's an owl. So they're describing what would be the prototypical gray alien. At the same time, what they're seeing or what they're perceiving in their mind is an owl. So something is taking place. I'm not going to guess what it might be. It's technology, it's psychic abilities. Somehow they're projecting the vision of an owl into the mind of the observer. And then once you've heard this story, like 500 times, like you get it, like you don't need to hear it again. But I'll be careful. I'm still fascinated by this aspect of it. But there's two things happening. There's the screen memory of the owl, and then there's the real owl. I feel those were real owls that Kristen and I saw. I have no doubt that those were real owls. I've had kind of somewhat opinionated researchers get right in my face and say those were not real owls, those were screen memories. There's no way I can prove whether it was or it wasn't. These were 11 inches tall. These were not 4 foot tall owls. Now, it's not just owls that show up in the screen memory. It's deer. So owl and deer are the top of the list. And then below that are raccoons and cats and squirrels and firemen and clowns show up in this stuff too. So it's like, so you're like, why do fear of clowns? Like, that's a funny one, right? When you factor this in. So let's back up. At the top of the list, I would say well over 50% of the screen memories, there's no way I can say this with any meaning, but this is my general sense. Over half of the screen memories would be either deer or owls, and they come in about even Steven as far as what people are reporting. Both owls and deer are rich in mythic power. They're not seeing squirrels and bunny rabbits. I guess there's like rabbits have mythic power too, but so they're seeing an archetype. The deer is the archetype of the forest. The owl is the archetype of the night. Right? The forest is a place of testing. The night is the place of our unconscious. So you don't have to take but just a half a step towards the myth, and you're flooded with these powerful stories. My overall argument, if I was to boil it down, is that the ancient mythology, the ancient folklore of the owl arose into our consciousness for a reason, and the modern UFO story is holding that place in our collective psyche. It is the ancient mythology playing out, this ever-present mythology that's been part of us since we stepped out of the caves, is showing up now in the UFO lore. I feel like there's a very real physical element to the UFO thing. Why this ancient mythology has attached itself to this, or has it always been attached to this side of the thing. So I'm not looking at the totality of the stories, right? So anyone, if you're anywhere in the world and you Google UFOs and owls, I'm the first thing that comes up. But the next 15 things below that, if you have an experience with a UFO and an owl, you're going to find me. And then I'm asking to hear your stories, and I'm getting those stories. Within those stories is such power and such mythic beauty that I am content to continue pulling on this string. It remains entirely engaging. It remains utterly rewarding as someone like following my obsession has been rewarding. Like I'm getting powerful feedback from it.
So when you had this experience, you were seeing these same 3 owls twice, so close. Do you think that's what activated you? That's what kind of flipped the switch inside you to make you begin this mission-driven focus on?
Well, it was more than just 3 owls. It was a woman named Kristen, who has Christ right in her name, telling me that her deepest feelings about God. At the same time, a voice was saying this has something to do with the UFOs, and so it was a collective onslaught.
Was it would you describe it as an audible voice, or was it more like a knowingness, like you just understand something? It was a shit sort of knowingness. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to tell you my stories. These are quick.
Take all the time you want. Yeah. Yeah.
This is half the reason I wanted to have this call with you, was just to tell you these stories. A number of years ago in my mid 30s, my now wife and I, we were told for many years, we were told that medically we couldn't have kids. It was just not in the cards for us. And I was going through a sort of a tumultuous period in my own life that I had to kind of make some decisions about things I was going to take with me and things I was going to leave behind. You know, that sort of middle of life moment where you have to you kind of have to make decisions about how you want to go forward. And I was there. That's where I was. And my wife, who's Peruvian, had arranged for me to take part in an ayahuasca ceremony in Cusco, Peru. And so we had gone on a trip to Peru. We were at this little cottage, very tiny little, house in the very, very outskirts of Cusco, and very high up in the mountains. It was cold, it was windy, and beautiful. And so I did this ceremony. I was in the ceremony, or as the ayahuasca took effect, I learned a number of things. I was shown a number of things. One of the things that I was shown was this little child. I was shown a vision of a little child, this little like toddler with just boundless energy, just sort of like leaping through the door and, doing what toddlers do, just being this spark of life. And this is right in the middle of being told, we weren't going to have kids, and we didn't have any plans to at that time. 5 years later, we somehow find out that we're going to have a kid. And it turns out that when my son was born, that's the kid that I saw. That was the one that I saw in my vision. So I had this pre-cognitive sort of vision of something that was going to come to pass, but not for another 4 or 5 years. And when it finally did happen, it was just sort of a shock. Right around that same time, 2017, when the UFO story was starting to pick up steam and take off, I was fascinated by it, and I was following it very closely. And then about 2 years ago, I decided I was going to start this channel, and I just had this sense that I need to do this. I just need to do this. I need to start talking about this. I couldn't quite put my finger on why, and I didn't know if I wanted to be publicly associated with it. And I struggled with that a lot. So in the early days, I had started this little YouTube channel, and I was just trying to sort of use it as like almost a video journal to sort of understand what things were going on and how I was thinking about it, and sort of walk through it. And then if anybody else wanted to join me on that journey, they were welcome to, do so. And for the first couple of months, it was really hard. And I was walking down the street one night with my dog. I was taking my dog on a walk in the evening, and I was really struggling with whether or not I should do it, because like any other thing, it takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. And I was a new father, and I didn't really have the time or energy to be doing this, but I was trying to find a way to make it work. And I was really sort of struggling internally with it. And it was dusk, and I was walking down my street, and I'm just kind of in my own head about, do I do this? Do I let it go? Do I just, what do I do? It's very difficult. And I look up. I was looking down at the ground where my dog was, and I look up, and there's a speed limit sign on this street, and 25 miles per hour. And on top of this sign was an owl looking right into my eyes. And I looked at it. I'd never seen an owl in this neighborhood before. Not that they're not there. I just had never seen one. This is right in that moment when I'm having that deep sort of conversation with myself. I look up, and this owl's looking right at me. And in my head, I just go, oh, hi. And there you are. And I just kind of acknowledge, and it stayed right there, and it just looked, and we had for like 2 minutes, we just sat there and we were looking at each other. And then I walked on by, and I looked back, and he was still there. He was watching me. It let me walk on by. It didn't fly away or anything. It was just still there. So I go about my business. A couple weeks later, I'm pushing my son on the swing in our backyard, and I'm pushing him. It's early in the morning. It must have been just after sunrise, about 7:30, something like that. I'm drinking a cup of coffee. We're having this little quiet moment, and I'm thinking about this channel. Do I want to keep doing this UFO podcast? Is this really worth all the energy I'm putting into it? Maybe there's something better I could be doing with my time. But I felt internally, no, I have to keep going with this. I have to keep doing this. And I looked up at that moment, and I looked at the fence line in our little backyard area, and standing on the fence right in front of a big oak tree. There's an oak tree that's about 2 feet wide, a big trunk. Right on the fence, I couldn't see the owl. I could only see its eyes, but there was an owl perched right there looking at me and my son on the swing. And I just saw its eyes open. And then I could see the owl, and its plumage was just perfectly matched to the tree that it was in front of. And I saw it and I was like, this is really weird. And internally, I just had this sense like, keep going. Both times. Every time I saw, these 2 times I saw this owl, internally, that's just the thought that I was left with. Just keep going, keep doing this. And then the third one happened just a few weeks ago. Very weird. I'm standing out in the yard, pushing my son on the swing again, just like we do in the morning, most weekends. And we're sipping coffee and just having a very quiet moment. We're listening to the birds. We're listening to the wind blow through the trees. It's just a gorgeous morning. And then out of nowhere, after about 5 minutes of this total quiet, he looks at me and he goes, Daddy, you were on the roof last night. And I go, what? And he goes, he's 3. Daddy, I saw you on the roof last night on the house. And I said, what? And he goes, yeah, you were on top of the house. And I said, no, Daddy was sleeping last night. I wasn't on top of the house. And he goes, yeah, you were on top of the house. I saw you. And I said, well, what else did you see? And then he just, trailed off like a 3-year-old does and went on to a different thing. The strangest moment. I don't know how to process that, but those are my 3 weird stories. Can you make any sense out of this?
Well, the first story is sort of a co-joined story where you had the knowing that you're going to do this podcast, and then you had doubts. And in both of those moments, an owl appeared. I've heard that story in one form or another. I've got to be really cautious what I say. Hundreds of times. So my strong sense is the experience you had has been happening since the beginning of time. Somebody in the village needed to do something. They felt drawn to it. They felt it was their mission to do something. They were doubting it. I am certain an owl was waiting for them as they left the cave. Exactly like you're telling. This would be the reason we have the mythology around owls. It's based on real life experiences, exactly like what you're describing. I'm speculating. I don't know that for sure. That's how I feel. I have no problem saying that. That's how I feel. So you are not alone. You are tapping into a historic, mythic lineage that I feel every thoughtful person, I feel, hears that story. You're not intellectually, it's ridiculous, right? It's just a random collision of chance. But in their heart, in their core, I have a feeling that any thoughtful person would just tap into that with a 100% knowing and understanding. Like, it makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah.
Now, so the issue on the roof. So obviously, your son was in the house, so he had no ability to see the roof.
He's never been on the roof. He's never seen me on the roof. I've never, in the 3 years he's been with us, I've never climbed on the roof for any reason. It's the strangest thing.
So it's how to say this. I know people who do the active UFO research, the experiencer type stuff, and they jump to conclusions all the time. I'm really cautious to jump to conclusions. I do it enough that I could get myself in trouble, but that's a powerful story. I've heard plenty of people who said, I heard owls on the roof. And I'm like, well, how'd you know they were owls? Like, did they hoot? And like, no, didn't hoot. And like, they have a metal roof over their house. And it's like, well, you never saw the owl. Because I'll dialogue with people mostly through email. And they're like, oh, you're right. I never did see anything, but I just knew it was an owl. I heard click, click, click on my roof. And I said, oh, there's an owl on my roof. Could have been any number of things. Could have been all, but a night bird, there's really only one big night bird. There's some smaller night birds, but there's only one big night bird, and that would be the owl. So that your son was saying something that he could not have seen unless he was outside. And so I'm not going to jump to the conclusions, but that's interesting. And then the 2 owl stories are exactly the kind of accounts that fill my email inbox.
It's so strange when it happens to you. And that's what resonated about your story with me is when I saw it, I was like, I've had this. I know what this feels like. I had that moment where I looked at the owl, I looked into its eyes, and then I just had this sense inside. It was like, keep going.
Oh, yeah. So
just keep going, keep doing it. Don't worry about the outcome. Just keep doing what you're doing. And that was it.
So at my experience with Kristen in the mountains, I saw those 3 owls, 2 different occasions, 4 days apart. I was denying. I was actively pushing. I was no way, not going to look into this. And at the same time, I knew I was reading these accounts and I'm like, oh, that missing time account sure sounds like what happened to me as a 12-year-old. And it's like, oh, it's pretty hard to dismiss those 5 beings standing outside my window, but I was denying, pushing them away, and I knew there was going to come a day.
So early 90s, this would have been right at the beginning when the X-Files was taking off on TV, and it was, I don't know how you feel about that show. How do you feel about the X-Files?
Pop culture stuff, sure. Yeah, I watch it. I love the show. Yeah, great. I mean, I don't think it's it's you can tell that the scriptwriters had a room. And I know some people who've done a lot of the deep dive into the X-Files. The scriptwriters had a room filled with UFO books. And they would just go through these books like, oh, let's use this. And so I can kind of sense what they're tapping into. So
I think Diana Pasulka discussed the X-Files a little bit about how some of the locations that they went to she went with Gary Nolan to look for some material that Tyler was going to be showing them, and it came up in discussion that this was a location that they had shot some stuff for the X-Files, and there was probably some kind of a connection. But
that's a synchronistic connection. I'm certain that no one in Hollywood got a call from the the Roswell secret team, and in the basement of Area 51, and said, go to this location to shoot your episode. I'm certain it was much more synchronistic, and there's a power to that. Right? That how did that happen?
So talk to me about the synchronicity connection and the symbology here. I think this is where I struggle a lot. I know it's where a lot of people struggle, is that there's just sort of this, it's like you described with the magnet. It's almost like ideologically, there's these two forces that are so very real individually, but for some reason, it's very hard for us to square that circle, that there is this weird, synchronicity. I've had it happen since I started this channel. I have people come out of the woodwork. I have people calling me, they're emailing me, and they're very talented, extremely smart people who are like, I can help you with this. I can help you with it. It's almost like they're self-forming this little team all around the world. All these, I turn around at a store and I'll look and there's the book that I need. It's to finish the thing that I'm working on. It's constantly. How does this all make sense in your mind? How does this tie into like a flying saucer? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like we go from like UFO and gray aliens to like, I reached out my hand at the store and I touched a shelf and I was holding the book that I needed, or,
Yeah.
It's like magic.
Magic is a perfect word. So scientists hate that word, right? Scientists don't want to hear the word magic. I'm not a scientist. I'm totally content to use the word magic. So synchronicity, I say this in my first book. I'm going to paraphrase myself poorly. Carl Jung had a long definition of synchronicity, which was the inner outer events that coalesce into a coincidence that has meaning to the observer. And the shorter definition would be a meaningful coincidence, right? There's all kinds of coincidences. If it doesn't have a deep meaning, it's not a synchronicity. And then my third shortest definition of synchronicity is magic. And I get some pushback on that because I have a slideshow with talks. I do that and I say magic, and then people come up to me after, you can't do that. And I was like, sure I can. Why can't I? So you're saying, so if you factor in that reality is not what we perceive it to be, it is something much richer, much more playful, much more interactive, much more powerful, much smarter than us. If that's the definition of reality, instead of this dead, mechanistic, materialistic version that we were taught in junior high school science class, if you factor in that reality is not what it is, what we're taught, then all of this we understand it all. If you grew up in a village in South Dakota, you would have, 400 years ago, you would have no problem tapping into powerful, meaningful coincidences. If you grew up in, I just think that we in the West are really the only culture that shuts down at the thought of the spark of magic showing up, right? You think about your old friend you haven't talked to in ages, and the phone rings and it's your friend. Everyone has that experience.
All the time.
Yeah. So
all the time. I don't know a single person that I've talked to. My mother saw orbs when I was a baby. She saw them in our house. She saw an orb go down the hallway and go into the door where I was sleeping when I was a little infant.
What do you do now? What are you doing now?
What am I doing now?
We're hosting a podcast about UFOs, but keep going.
Yeah. So, right. Exactly. So, she has dreams where she sees orbs. You have Chris Bledsoe, who seemingly can summon orbs at will and get them on camera night after night after night after night. I'm a fan of recently I've become a really big fan of remote viewing, and I've been reading a lot of Ingo Swann's work, and he dedicates his book, Everybody's Guide to Natural ESP, is dedicated to Hal Puthoff. And so there's this connection to the Stanford Research Institute, the consciousness research that was being done at the late 70s and early 80s for the intelligence agencies. And we're starting to hear now that there's a connection between actual nuts and bolts craft and some kind of consciousness as a fundamental fabric of reality, and that maybe there's a technology that can be built to harness that or to interact with it. Or it's almost like we don't have the words to even really describe what's going on because of the materialist paradigm.
Sure we do.
Do you think
mystical words? Sure. Like the Bhagavad, like ancient mystical texts are filled with just the right words. Yeah, we got the right words. We just don't like them because they're fluffy and new agey and woo woo. We have a knee jerk reaction. We collectively in the West, I feel like I'm totally, and even I have stuff that people tell me stuff in my toes curl in my shoes sometimes. Like, ooh, that's,
Did you ever see, there's a clip online of, I don't know what podcast this was, but it's been circling around in the UFO community for a little while now. And it's a podcast, and it was recorded in South America, and the host is interviewing two Indigenous people and he says, have you guys ever seen an alien? And they don't know what he's talking about. And then he shows them a picture of a gray, and they go, oh, that's the ant people.
Mm-hmm. E alienígena não tem.
Como?
Alienígena.
Alienígena? Que é?
Nunca, essa palavra você nunca ouviu falar? Alienígena.
Alienígena, não. Isso chama-se Mayushibu.
Isso aqui?
Sim.
Mancunawabu.
Mancunawabu.
Sério?
Mancunawabu é um que mora debaixo da terra.
Eu falei, esse aí.
Que se virou formiga hoje, que nós chamamos Una, que é uma formiga grande, chama-se Mancunawabu.
Que essa formiga também é muito perigosa, né, Boina? Se as pessoas ficam mexendo com ela demais, ela leva o espírito da pessoa para debaixo da terra também. Para voltar tem que ser um pajé bem bom.
São seres que pode aparecer em luz divina, com a luz do Nishipan. São seres que a gente pode ter o contato, que moram debaixo da terra.
And it seems like Indigenous people have space. They have a comprehensive view of reality that includes a lot of this stuff. Regardless of which culture you're talking about, it's just sort of wrapped all under in the same wrapping. And it seems like here we just, like you said, we jettisoned that idea. And if it can't be measured or examined with a microscope, then it's not real. And the burden of proof is on people who have extraordinary experiences to somehow prove that it was real and not just the figment of their imagination. Is there a connection? I mean, what is, in your view, between Indigenous cultures and some of the things that you're talking about, of course, with the owls and everything else?
Well, John Mack's second book, he's written a bunch of books, but his final book, which was the follow-up to Abduction, is called Passport to the Cosmos. And in that book, he compares and contrasts the UFO contact experience to the initiation rites of the shaman. And he was very proud of that book. In the memoir that Ralph Blumenthal did on Dr. Mack called The Believer, Mack, near the end of his life, was basically saying, like, that book Abduction, I just got so much pushback on that one. And then I wrote this other book where I talked about all the mystical stuff. No, it never got reviewed in any meaningful way. No one touched that book. I mean, considering I find that book is very, very important. So that book addresses exactly what you're articulating there. And it's exactly what I'm finding here. These ideas I've had for a long time, and they're in my first book. I talk about them, but they just have gotten stronger and stronger and stronger. And I feel more powerful. I feel they're more powerful in the way I align myself with this mystery. Like right from the beginning, I was all on fire with like UFOs and owls. Like UFOs and owls are connected. Oh, here, let me do one more thing. So you were asking about synchronicity. Like I have worked very hard in my own, the way I hold myself against, or as I work towards these mysteries, or I work to understand these mysteries. There's owls, there's UFOs, and there's synchronicity. So there's these three seemingly divergent elements. I'm treating them as all the same thing. Not so much that they are the same thing, because they're obviously not, but I try to put them on an even playing field as far as their power. So someone has a powerful synchronicity. I treat that with the same reverence as if they had a close-up UFO sighting, right? If someone has your owl experiences, those are intertwined with the UFO thing, because you were thinking, should I do this UFO podcast? Should I continue with this UFO podcast? You were confronted with an owl. It is perfect. It is right there. That is language that I understand, given the thousands of people I've talked with over the last 15 years. I try to weigh those things equally. So owls and UFOs seem to be connected. But as I'm receiving these letters, there are 5 what I'll call modalities or topics. One is owls and UFOs. Okay, we're not going to run out of time. I can talk about this for weeks and I'll never run out of stories. So owls and UFOs. The other one would be owls and let me just go, meditation. People meditating have powerful owl experiences. I get a lot of letters. People doing psychedelics, most particularly mushrooms, have powerful owl experiences. Sometimes there's psychedelic visionary experiences where they see like a 20-foot glowing white owl that, turns their...
I saw a 150-foot tall body of a human with the face and head of a bird in my vision when I was thinking on my ayahuasca experience.
So, I'm happy to talk about that. But here, let me just finish up here. So the psychedelic experience, most particularly through mushrooms, I've had very few with ayahuasca. I remember I actually had this thought one day. I was thinking this. I said, well, I don't have any LSD stories of owls and LSD. Within a few days, I had 2 in my email inbox. I thought about it and 2 arrived in my email inbox. Owls and the Shamanic Initiation. That's John Mack's book. That's very consistent. I'll tell some stories before we're done here. Owls and death. This is the richest vein of all of them, is owls and death. People reporting owls around the time of a death of a loved one. The folklore is that if you hear the hooting of an owl, that someone is about to die. This is in Shakespeare. It's in all kinds of stuff. It's in movies. It's all over the place. Like I got my ears attuned to it. And I don't think people are doing it even consciously. There'll be a spooky scene and there'll be a forest scene and an owl hoot. And then the next scene, someone ends up dead. Right. So I don't think anyone planned that out. I don't think the scriptwriter wrote it in there. I think it just happened organically in the synchronistic cogs of our collective understanding of the mythos, just plugged that in with nobody even being aware of it. So with these 5 things, UFOs, meditation, psychedelics, shamanic initiation, and death. Boy, I could tell some death stories and I've had some personal experiences. So the owl seems to be connected to these things. So it's not that the owl is connected to UFOs, is that these 5 events, which I'm calling highly charged human experiences, there might be more out there. These are the ones that have shown up in my research. So these 5 experiences, these highly charged human experiences, the owl is connected to a highly charged human experience, of which a UFO contact or sighting certainly qualifies as a highly charged human experience, as does death, as does something as simple as meditation. You look at those lists. UFOs, psychedelics, meditation, shamanic initiation, and death. All of them could be easily described as a mystical event. The passing on to ending of this life and then entering the afterworld all of those could be seen as mystical events. So there is a kind of common thread. So why is the owl connected to, what's the pattern between these? So it's not so much that the owl is connected to UFOs, it's the owl is connected to this powerful, mystical, somewhat elusive, difficult to pinpoint collection of events. You asked a question early on. I just got all sidetracked there, but I feel it's really important for me. It's really important to me for it to say exactly that, because as I realize that the mystery is much richer than just a metal spaceship in the nighttime sky.
Well, it was one of the things that it's something that I struggle with sometimes when I have conversations like this, is because we're talking about something that is so enormous and it's so difficult to put into words, these types of experiences. And so when you do put it into words, as you well know, I'm sure, you do have to leave a lot. It gets lost in translation, but you're doing your best to articulate something that was, an amazing spiritual experience.
Well, that's the role of the poet, right?
Exactly. It reminds me of, I think it was something that Whitley Strieber wrote about this. He would meditate. And when he would meditate, he would sit in this one particular chair. And he talked about how, was it his wife who had passed away, who said she could see him when he was meditating. He had a vision, and she said, "I can see you when you're meditating. You glow. You're in the chair. You're in this chair." And it makes me wonder if maybe these highly charged experiences that people describe are activating this spiritual core, or your if you want to call it a soul or whatever you want to call it, but something fundamental beneath the physical from which everything else emerges. And when that switches on like a light, maybe owls are attuned to that and they're attracted to it some way.
I
So that the arrival of owls is just that you're suddenly popping up on their radar in a weird way that you wouldn't normally. Does that, I don't know. Does that sound like anything you've ever heard before?
I wrote about it. There's a whole chapter dedicated to almost exactly that thought. Like, what are the owls attracted to?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, are they attracted to, so UFOs are this energetic thing, they make the energy between the magnets. Can the owls see that? The owls, there's no other animal on Earth that has a more highly attuned night vision. So the ability to see into the dark, or there's no animal on Earth that has as good a hearing as the owl. The owl can fly in the forest in complete darkness and hear. They're not looking for the mice on the forest floor. They are listening for the mice on the forest floor. They fly in the forest in complete darkness, listening for a mouse on the forest floor, and they can catch it in what we would call complete darkness. They have highly developed eyes, so we can say, oh, evolution created these eyes. Ancient man wouldn't have known that. They would have said the owl is magic, that they can fly into the night. Now, that would turn into the owl a metaphor for flying. The forest means something to us. Now that we have the electric light bulb, we've lost the myth of the forest, because before the electric light bulb, the forest was a place of testing. It was a place of mystery. It was a place of danger. So the owl flies into the forest. It becomes a metaphor for flying into the darkness, flying into the unconscious, flying to the land of the dead, flying into the land of the gods, flying into that other realm. And then the next step is, and this is the one thread that would, there's all the world's mythologies about owls are kind of wishy-washy and different, but the one thread would be the owl flies into the dark and comes back with a message. So I was looking at these owls with Kristen, and I heard a voice in my head, a message, say this has something to do with the UFOs. My old life essentially ended on those 2 camping nights. And a new life began because I got completely sidetracked and obsessed. And the work that I was doing for the outdoor school just crumbled away right around that time. And this new life emerged. And I am in essence a different person because of that. So here, let me tell a story, because this is I love these kinds of stories. I get an account from a guy. He's from Michigan. He grew up on an Indian reservation in Michigan. I had to look it up. It was the Huron tribe. I think that's right. The Huron tribe in Michigan is shaped like a mitten, and it would be, I think we're backwards here, but it would be right by Lake Huron. And I looked it up on a map. It doesn't look like much. It looks like a neighborhood. And so he says, I had a kite as a boy on the reservation, and I loved this kite. And I would fly this kite, and I had a special little, like the ball of string had like a little controller, so I could control the kite. And so he was 12 years old, and something that had never happened before. This big gust of wind came along, and it took the kite and pulled it out of his hand, and the ball of string just went up into the air, and the kite flew into the forest. It left the meadow, flew into the forest, and he could see kind of where it went in the forest. So he got a friend. He said, let's go find my kite. So they walked into the forest and looked and looked and looked, and then they saw the kite at the top of the tree. And they walked to the base of the tree, and at the base of the tree was an owl, and the owl was all wrapped up in the string. And the owl would have died. So they got an adult, and they came back, and they cut the owl free, and the owl was injured. So they kept the owl until it was healthy, and they released the owl. He told me this story, and I said, are you a shaman? And he said, oh man, in a word, yes. And I don't want to say too much, but he told some stories that his role as the shaman was something very challenging for him. Like it was a challenge. So there's no UFO in this story, but it is everything about the myth of the owl in its role. Now, if I was a Jungian psychoanalyst and someone came in and laid down on my couch and said, I had a dream last night where I was flying my kite, and the kite flew into the forest, and there was an owl tangled up, and I cut the owl free and let it go. Like, wow, does that have some mythic power? Like, I don't know what that means, but I can feel in me the mythic power of that. I don't have the vocabulary to say what truly happened. So I can also say that the fact that I said, are you a shaman, should tell you the kinds of letters I've been receiving. I kind of knew just where this was going. So it does, if someone writes a beautiful poem and you dissect it and then write your college doctoral thesis on the use of commas in this poem. Like it's gonna subtract the magic of that poem by overanalyzing it. So I got to be really cautious just to let that story and hundreds of stories just like that. I have to let those. I just have to trust that there is a magic that if I can tap into that glow of that story, then maybe that's all that I need to do.
The conversation in ufology right now seems to be really focused on this government disclosure idea, and it seems like that's kind of taken a lot of the air out of the room from some of the other things that people would normally be talking about. Do you get the sense that there's like Chris Bledsoe talks about a new knowledge, a spiritual awakening, 1,000 years of peace, beginning sometime around 2026? In other words, some impending event that is going to result in the enlightenment or raised consciousness of humanity. It's not just him that's been saying stuff like that. We've heard that from a lot of different people for many, many years. Personally, just from your own experience, do you have an internal sense that something has shifted psychologically or spiritually with people in general, with the world at large? Are we moving into some kind of a new paradigm in your view? And is that maybe what could be behind a lot of these anomalous experiences that people are having? Or is this just something that goes on like this all the time and people are just becoming more aware of it?
It sure feels like it's accelerating. Whether it is like I live one life, like I was living in New York City doing, advertising work. And then I moved out west and was teaching skiing and such. So in that, and then my life shifted and I started doing this owl and UFO research. So I have been surrounding myself with a new group of friends and acquaintances, and my email inbox looks different than it looked like before this chapter of my life. And so I feel like it's reflecting back. I'm putting energy out, and that energy is reflecting right back. So I'm swimming in exactly this mystery, which I wasn't before. So it sure feels front and center for me in my life. Is it increasing? You can make a pretty good case that it's increasing. And so you mentioned Stanford and Juan and everything like that. And then Jim Marrs wrote a book on this, which was unpublished for a while. And just before his death, he actually published the book, and it was called Psi Spies.
I know Jim Marrs. Yeah, he was great.
He was an amazing character. And then Jacques Vallée has stated this very plainly. So the original, they got what amounted to a random sampling of people to do the remote viewing research. That included Joe McMoneagle and Lynn Buchanan. And in that group of the original military trained remote viewers, they looked for similarities between them. All of the original crew, all of them had at some point in their life a close-up UFO contact, what we might call abduction. All of them. Like, I'll tell you, Hal Puthoff knows that. Like, this is something that is not a mystery. So the remote viewing and UFO contact, I don't think this is universal now. There's more remote viewers than there were in 1974. But the initial group all had UFO contact. In 1974 was long before Bud Hopkins and the pop culture knowledge of UFO contact.
It's just like it's almost like it's scripted this way, and it's playing out like beat by beat. This interview with Jake Barber, Ross Coulthart did a few weeks ago, the 3-hour version of this, he talks about the psionic assets that they actually recruit people specifically for their psychic ability, because they can summon and control these craft or influence them to come into a particular area and then set down in a field, and then they can go out and retrieve the craft. The psionic assets describe linking with a craft, and they're presented almost with some sort of like a psychic interface that they can interact with, and they can have the craft do things. He talks about the different groups and demographics that have the highest numbers of telepaths within them. And they talk specifically about women. Left-handed gay men, for some reason, seem to be a source of a lot of telepaths. Children, certain people with indigenous lineage. There's just these certain groups that it's almost like they have been studying this, and I've identified like maybe genetic markers or certain kind of markers where they can look at certain people and go, this person is more than likely going to have the talent set that we need. It just seems like this is all starting to come out in a very public and practical way, almost like this is something that anybody can tap into more or less if they really want to. Some people might have like a special talent for it.
I think that's one of the, I mean, I think you could get a book on remote viewing and then just, they have apps for your phone to like practice remote viewing. People, it's not 100%, but that's, you know, like anyone can play the piano if they study hard enough. Very few people can be a virtuoso. But so I think we all have that innate talent. I met Russell Targ and he did a little thing where he said, you know, he had a talk and he said, okay, do you have a paper and pencil ready? Because I'm going to ask you a question. And then he said, what, the next slide that I'm going to show, you know, draw the interesting thing that will show up in the next slide I show. And just he had a little simple exercise, just let your mind be free. And this was like 20 seconds of what here's what you need to know. He described it in less than a minute. And I drew this little thing. And then I went up to him afterwards and I showed him. I could tell you about it. It was pretty close, but it was like remarkably close. And I drew something. So I drew what looked like gazebo in a town square, and it was kind of swirling upward, like it was made out of rose thorns. And rose thorns have this shape, and I was drawing this repeating shape, that kind of rose thorn shape. And then I drew it in my little sketchbook, and then the next image came up. It was funny. I didn't recognize it at the time. I was like, oh, this doesn't mean anything. And then the next day I was like, well, that was pretty close. And I talked to him the next day. But it was a sculpture in the commons, in the square, on the campus of Stanford. And it's a sculpture of dolphins swimming in a circle. And the dolphins were, so like the nose of one dolphin was touching the tail of another one, and the dolphin's dorsal fin and then their side fins look like rose thorns. So I was drawing this swirling thing with these rose thorns. So it was actually pretty close. Interestingly, the benches, I drew the benches almost exactly. I wasn't worried about the benches. I'm a professional illustrator. I could draw a bench really fast. And I showed it to him, and then he was like, this is quite good. And that's my understanding that that's universal in people who try remote viewing for the first time, like nail it, and then they never can do it again because their mind is clouded with expectations. Or maybe
fascinating. This conscious disconnection, it seems to be coming more to the forefront of everything that's going on right now, and in a very public way. And I just think that's so fascinating. All this stuff that's been, 40, 50 years ago that's starting to come back out and resurface, all this research. We're finding out that Hal Puthoff has been right at the center of all of it for all of this time, going back as far as you want to go. When you went through this period in your own life where you became obsessed with the subject and you kind of fell into the UFO rabbit hole, so many people describe a similar experience. What was this like for you internally? What was your experience like of going through that period, and describe that?
Lord. Oh my! So I say between 2006 and 2013, I spent 95% of my waking hours wondering if I had gone insane. Like totally, like it was the synchronicities were so powerful. Here, I wrote a book. My memoir is essentially me writing about all the synchronicities that took place in those years. And it's, 350 pages of me it's basically the blog posts I was writing in real time about these synchronistic events. So honestly, there was a little health food store in the town I lived in, this little itty bitty town. There was this adorable little health food store in this crunchy little hippie ski bum town. And there were these young women that would work at the health food store, and I would go in there and they were my therapists. I tried to go to therapy. So I have a history of depression. I'm open to talking about that. And so I knew what it meant to go into therapy and stuff like that. And I would try to tell the therapist these stories, and I realized like, this isn't working at all. This therapist is not really well equipped. So that's when I started reaching out. I was reaching out to people who had the experience. I was reaching out to Mac Tonnies, but oddly, I would go in and tell the crew of people that worked at this health food store, like, here's what happened last night. Here's what happened this morning. Here's what happened on the bike ride in. And I was having stuff with animals, with owls, with very few, and I had a few what would be UFO contact experiences in those years, but they were kind of few and far between, but the synchronicities were ever present.
So do you think, you described them earlier as sort of separate, but happening sort of in connection with one another, but do you connect your missing time experience with your later obsession with the subject? I mean, in other words, was this something that started in childhood and then just started to manifest as you grew into adulthood, and then you just kept following it further and further? How does this all connect for you? It just seems like your whole life is filled with
but I had a huge long stretches where I was, like live in the, like I lived in a big apartment in Manhattan as a 24-year-old and was doing, I was working freelance doing pre-production work for TV commercials and stuff like that. I was living an entirely different life. Yeah. So
that by itself is a whole interesting dimension to this story, because it's as a former New Yorker myself, it's you're at the heart of the materialist paradigm, especially working in an advertising agency or in the advertising field. I worked in advertising for many years myself and television. And it couldn't be farther away from the health food store in the hippie granola town. You know what I mean?
And I would have laughed in someone's face if they said these things. Well, that's not quite true. There's things that I did take seriously, like psychic abilities and stuff like that. I would have been very dismissive of it. All that changed. How are we doing for time?
I've got time if you've got time. We're about 20 minutes is what we had left, but we can go a little longer if you want.
Because early on, I said, I can't really tell the story out of order. Like, I don't want to leapfrog over the middle to get to this one story. But we
put a pin in that. Yeah.
If you want to hear the story, feel free to I like telling the story, but it is not something that I can tell quickly. To tell it correctly requires a little bit of time. And then you jump in. If you just ask questions, like, don't you dare be shy about interrupting me. Cause one of my superpowers is the ability to drone on and on and on. In 2006, I had the experience with Kristen in the mountains. In the next few years, as I said before, it felt like I had gone insane. Just the synchronicities had a power that I could not digest. It was so overwhelming. And then I started going to UFO conferences and I started obsessively reading UFO books. I started the blog. I had a podcast. My podcast started in 2009. I went on hiatus and dormant for a while as well. I was writing the books, and I was coming home from a UFO conference in 2013. And that would have been in the spring of 2013. And the conference was in Arizona and I lived in Idaho. So you got to drive through Utah. And I love Utah. It's like the thought of doing a road trip, taking your time and driving through the beautiful canyonlands of Utah is it's heaven for me. I'm coming back from the UFO conference. I was already well known as the owl guy at this point. Like I had been focusing on the owl stuff and I'd been asking people for owl stories. And so I'd been actually at the conference asking people, hey, do you have any owl stories? Give me your phone number. Give me your email address. I want to talk with you about this. And I'm driving home. I would have been a decade ago, so I would have been in my early 50s. And I worked at doing outdoor stuff, so I'm just completely content camping on the side of the road, and especially in a empty place like Utah. So I had a big sleeping bag and a pad in my car and stuff like that, so it was late, and I kind of knew where I was going to go. So I pulled into this. The sun was setting. This was March 10th, 2013, the evening of March 10th. I call this my confirmation event. It's a bunch of events that all can glom together. So I pull off the side of the road and I lay down my sleeping bag and it's magical. It's cold. It's wintertime still, early March. And the trillion billion stars, it's just perfect. And I got a big, thick winter sleeping bag I love this. This is part of I love doing this. So I'm just in this magic place looking at the stars and I drift off to sleep and I wake up and there is a big round thing on this hill nearby, kind of rolly hill, the sagebrush and stuff like that. And on top of this hill is this big round thing, looked like a water tank or a water tower. And I look up at this thing and I say, that looks just like a landed flying saucer. And I look at this thing and I'm looking at it and it's calm. I can just stare at this thing. And I had just been to a UFO conference and I'd been having on and off these kind of psychic events. And I say to myself, if this was a UFO, I'd know it. I would know it, right? Like I would just feel some sort of psychic mojo in deep down. And so I look at this thing and I feel nothing. I feel nothing at all. So I roll over and go back to sleep. A little while later, I wake up and there's a coyote, actually two coyotes. One was very close, and the other one was a little bit farther away. And these two coyotes are calling. And I sit up and I've slept out many hundreds of nights in terrain just like this. And I've heard a lot of coyotes. And I have never, ever, ever, ever heard one that close. So I sit up and I'm looking around like, where is this thing? It felt like I could reach out and hand it a dog biscuit. Felt like it was that close, and there was nothing to see. And I'm lying there and I look up and there's the big round structure on that hill, still there.
How far away was the hill?
So I measured it out, and it's 1.25 miles or something like that. So in a clear desert night, that's the clarity of the sky, of the air is pretty good. So whatever it was big. And then, but the rugged mountain structure on the hill was over 1 mile away, but the coyote felt like it was right next to me. So I laid down and again, I was like, I love this. Like I wasn't scared of a little coyote, but I love this magic of like the singing of the coyote and just the loudness. It was so incredible. And so I roll over and go back to sleep. And then I wake up again and there's a bush right at my feet. And there's this bright light behind the bush. And I kind of sit up and I kind of do this. And I'm like, where is that? What's behind that bush? And there was nothing to see. And I was like, oh, someone did exactly what I'm doing. Is they just pulled off the side of the road. And this was a spot that other people had camped before. And there was like old fire rings and beer cans and stuff like that. So like I wasn't the first person to park there, but it was well a ways from the road that there was no traffic lights or anything. So, and there was no traffic on this little road, Highway 20 in southern Utah. And I laid back and went to sleep. The next morning I woke up and I got in my car. And it's interesting. I don't remember looking up at the hill to see if that thing was still there. It might have been there, but I have no memory of looking up at the hill. When I woke up, it was still dark. And I got in my car and I drove home. So about 10-hour drive. And when I got home, I don't think I even took my coat off, looked up on Google Maps to see what that big round structure was. There was nothing there. Now I'll add that I have since been back to that site many times. This was 12 years ago now. I've been back to that spot many times and there's no round structure on that hill. I want to walk up to that hill. I've never had the chance to actually walk up. It's been winter every time I've been back. So I get on Google Maps. I make a drawing of it. I did this kind of rendering of it. I can send you any of this stuff if you want. And I kind of figured out the GPS coordinates of where I was and I got really obsessed. And then the next day, so that would have been the 10th, the 11th, the 12th, the next day, I was at my desk. And I had actually written a blog post the day before, which is exactly what I was doing. It's like, I had this weird thing. I saw this thing on the hill. I put the GPS coordinates on the blog post. I put the image on the blog post. And I was like, I'm sort of walking from room to room and I'm near my desk and I have this kind of like, it just felt like click, flash, click. And I had this vision of a map of southern Utah. Here, I'll draw this for you. This is like, I'm an illustrator. I have a chance to draw something. I'm going to do it. This is not much. But I had an image and it was a line in a map with 3 push pins on it, and it would have been in southern Utah. And then, so this is what it looked like. So a line on the map, can you see it? With 3 push pins on it. And then there's the big plus sign that's invading that little thin line was the Four Corners area. So 2 of those dots are in Utah. 1 of the dots is in Colorado.
This is in your mind.
Boom.
You just get a
hyper
flash.
Vivid, unmistakable, seared into my mind. I made maps. I was doing outdoor work. I made maps all the time. I made camping maps and hiking maps and stuff like that. I just sat down and made a map. So I knew exactly where the one was the night before. I had just gotten the GPS coordinates for it, where I had been sleeping out under the stars. And I knew this event that had taken all the way to the east in Dolores, Colorado, which had taken place in 2010. I had an event there to tell that story. I'll tell a little bit of it. I was driving around the West with my friend Natasha, who I met at a UFO conference, who had contact experiences. So we both had these contact experiences. We're driving around this beautiful part of the desert. She was living in Germany. She came to America to drive around the West with me. And we had this great trip. It was the beautiful, perfect road trip in the spring in the desert. The weather was perfect. We camped. We saw such beautiful terrain. And then there was a night where I was driving, we were coming down from Mesa Verde, which is a national park with the cliff dwellings. And we arrived in this town of Cortez, Colorado. And we get to the town and the brakes are acting funny in my car. And there's a funny smell and I can feel there's heat under one wheel. And I take it I asked some guy in the main street, like, where's a good mechanic? Little town. He says, oh, everyone goes to this place for a Subaru. So I take the car in and he puts it up on the rack and he says, here, wait, I'll be back in a few minutes. So we sit around in this beautiful little town, this idyllic little town. And then the guy comes out and he's got the oily rag and he's wiping his hands. And he says, I can't let you leave town or you'll die. I'm like, okay, what's going on? He said, your brakes are about to fail. Like, it would be irresponsible for me. If you were in an accident, the sheriff's department would have every right to like I cannot let you leave this car with this car. And he said, I can fix it.
It's going to cost you $10,000.
No, it was going to take 5 days. It was one little part, but
that sounds like a mechanic story.
Yeah,
I can't let you leave.
So he played it up for maximum drama, and I was like, whoa. So it was some parts, but it was going to take 5 days for the parts to come in. So the guy who ran the shop, he said, listen, I know the lady down the road. Well, I'll give her a call. We'll get you a cheap rent-a-car. So we got this totally cheap rent-a-car. It was a great car. It was like my car was kind of dumpy. This was a joy to drive this car. So there's Natasha and I. We got 5 days to drive around. So we had this great trip. But that first night, we just needed to camp somewhere near the town. So we asked someone at the coffee shop, like, where do people camp? You go to a little town out west. I got really good at this. You go to a little town out west and you say, where do I camp? Where's a good spot to camp? Every local say, here's the spot. So we went to the spot and we set up a tent and we climbed in the tent. And that night, Natasha and I woke up screaming. Like both of us woke up screaming. And the way I describe it, this is so tough. I describe it as synthetic fear. She said, I saw a face. So I'm like, what does that mean? What is it like? So we're like, we're trying to figure this out. And then all of a sudden, like I climbed on top of her the way, like if someone had thrown a hand grenade in the tent. And I was just like, this is something. And then there came a point when it was just like, we went from the height of adrenaline freak out to asleep. And then as soon as I fell asleep, I had this sensation that like I was floating, like I'm floating up. And I look in the corner of the tent. And now this is weird. Like, so if I'm floating, are my eyes open? Or like, how do I look in the tent? Am I asleep? This is all very murky. This is my memory. All I can do is share my memory. I don't trust this memory, but this is the memory I have. I'm floating up. I have the palpable elevator up feeling. I look in the corner of the tent by Natasha's feet, and there's a round pizza pan shaped image. It feels somewhat like semi-real, like semi-transparent, and it was a round pizza pan with a single dot in the middle. So a round circle with a single dot. So I'm floating up and it feels like I pass right through the roof of the tent. Like I don't even bump into the roof of the tent. And I'm suddenly in this white realm and I'm saying, I have to remember this. I have to remember this. I have to remember this. And then I go, am I on a table? Am I on a table? Am I on a table? And then I hear Natasha's voice with her German accent. She goes, Mike, you're floating. And I go, whoosh, and I'm back in the tent. No, I don't think this happened. She doesn't remember saying that. So the next morning we wake up and I'm like, what happened last night? What happened last night? She said, I don't know. Like what, she said, I saw a face. I'm like, well, can you describe this face? Now, to tell the story properly. Okay. I'm going to back up a little bit. So we're a story within a story within a story. I'm going to back up and tell it. This is the problem with telling these things. Like it's just layer upon layer. So I still have it, a very small minor cataract in my right eye. And I noticed this in 2008. And then it stayed there till 2009. But in 2009, I was in a park on a lovely afternoon. I was in Pasadena, California. I was traveling. And I kind of did the thing, when your eyelashes are kind of just half open and the sun's up there and you can kind of see the blooms, the sort of visual blooms of the lens of your eye. You can see. So in this bloom, I could see, and this is on my blog. I did a very detailed rendering of this. I could see an image of a little person, a little face, and it would look like a little man, a bald man with big eyes, seated like a little Buddha with like a halo around him, like you would put around a deity in a Hindu painting. And it was like kind of that psychedelic lens flare that you get. And it was hyper vivid. And I remember sitting in this park, and I already had the blog at this point. I'm in the park in Pasadena. And I'm like, oh God, now I got to do a stupid blog post about this thing in my eye. And I'm the only one who can see it. So when I got back to my my cabin in Idaho, I did a very tight, detailed pencil rendering of it and put it on my blog. This is what I saw in my eye. Now I'm bald. I have kind of biggish eyes, and it looked like me. So it looked like a caricature of me, seated like a Buddha. But at the same time, it looked sort of like a gray alien. And at the same time, it looked sort of like a death skull. I can send you an image of this too. I wake up in the tent. Oh, so when I was floating in the tent and I saw the pizza pan, I thought to myself, ooh, that looks like the thing in my eye. Didn't look anything like the thing in my eye. It looked like a floating pizza pan with a single dot in the middle. I looked at this thing and said, oh, that looks like the thing in my eye. But it didn't. But that's what I thought. So I say, Natasha, what happened? She said, I saw a face. I'm like, tell me, what do you mean you saw a face? And I pictured she saw like a face right in front of her off the nose or something. And just like, where was it? And I had not told her anything yet. And she pointed to the corner of the tent by her feet. She said it was right there. And that's exactly where I saw the floating pizza pan. I said, what did it look like? She said, oh, I can't tell you what it looked like. How am I supposed to describe what it looked like? Please try to describe what it looked like. She said, well, the only thing I can describe it as is, you remember that thing you drew on your blog, that face in your eye that you saw in your eye? That's what it looked like. So I get up, I leave the tent, I walk around, I'm looking for a burn mark in the yard, and in the field there where like maybe a flying saucer landed. I didn't find anything. It's totally lovely morning in Colorado. The birds are chirping. It's just magic. It's perfect. And then we had needed something to do. So I called a friend and she said, you go to the Canyon de Chelly in the Navajo reservation and you have a sweat lodge ceremony with the native elder there. And so we said, great. So we found out where it was. We called the guy on the phone. He runs a campground. So he's going to run a sweat lodge ceremony. So great. So Natasha and I spend the day driving to Canyon de Chelly. Have you ever been there? It's one of the most beautiful, powerful places I've ever been on Earth. And it looks like it's spelled de Chelly, but it's Canyon de Chelly, Dechelly, and it's on the Navajo reservation in Arizona. So we get there, we do this wonderful tour, and then that evening I take off my shirt. Like, we're totally car camping, we're grubby and we're camping out and and so I take off my shirt. I have a scratch that starts at my left shoulder and goes down to my belly button. Like, I would know. It looked like a single cat claw or a single rose thorn had dragged across my chest. But when you looked at it closely, it wasn't a scratch at all. It was a row of tiny fluid-filled blisters, like a 0.5 millimeter size blister, all dot in a row from my shoulder to my belly button. I'd never seen anything like that before. And then a few days later, I took a shower and it just washed off. When it was gone, Natasha and I both said, oh, we should have taken a picture. Like, she's a UFO investigator in Germany, pretend to be a UFO. Neither of us even thought about it. So we have the sweat lodge ceremony, which is beautiful. It was really moving. There was a few other people there, and there was 4 segments of it where you have 4, you honor each cardinal direction, the past, the present, the future, and the guy who ran it was wonderful. He sang and he was funny and he was beating a drum, and it got so hot in there. Oh my God, it got so hot in there. It was such a release. And the theme was surrender. So this story, I just sidetracked this one story, and it began with a guy saying, you can't leave town or you'll die. And it ended with a guy saying, with a shamanic ceremony of death and rebirth. I mean, you enter the sweat lodge to die from the heat, metaphorically, and you emerge reborn, metaphorically. So that was March. So that was I think that would have been that would have been May of 2010, that event. So that's one of the lines on this map. That would have been this point here. Here's the one that happened the night before. Here's the one that happened 2 years earlier. I had to figure out what the middle one was. So I kind of took I saw a straight line. And I kind of looked at the map and I said, well, I've camped all over. I've traveled all over that stuff. And I thought, oh my God, I had that experience with Natasha in 2011. And so in 2011, Natasha and I were coming back from a UFO conference. We were driving from Arizona to my house in Idaho. And so we camped on the side of the Burr Trail Road, which is this beautiful road in southern Utah. It was this completely big, grand landscape we were camped in, and we were camped in the sandy spot. And now Natasha had come from Germany. So she wakes me up in the middle of the night. She says, Mike, I can't sleep. What do I do? And I'm like tired. I've been driving all day. I'm like, well, I'm going to take a walk. And I'm like, really? Take a walk? Is it safe? And I'm like, oh, this part of Utah, it's safe. Don't you worry at all. So she took a walk and I laid there. And when she left, an owl started hooting in the bush right next to my head. And I was so close, and the owl was so loud. The owl was booming, incredibly loud. It was a great horned owl. It's unmistakable, the call of the great horned owl. Mm-hmm. Now I've I've heard a lot of owls. I know that sound. I have never been that close to the owl. I sat up and I tried to see it in this bush. I couldn't see it. It was in that bush, but I couldn't see it. In retrospect, this reminds me so much of the coyote that I heard on Highway 20. So I'm listening to this owl. Natasha comes back. She says, Mike, we got to leave. Like, what? And she tells me this story. She says, I was walking on this road. She said, and we talked about this a lot. We sat with maps. We worked on this thing for a week. And she said, I felt like I didn't need a flashlight. The landscape and the stars were so beautiful. It felt like I was sparkling. And then there was a light on the side of the road, and the light was bright white light, and it was kind of floating. And I said, is there someone out there with a flashlight? But the light was a floating orb, and it rushed towards me. And as it got closer, it like grew huge, and then boom, it burst and like exploded in light. And then she was scared. She ran back to me and woke me up. And then I was scared, and I'm like, let's get out of here. So we drove away. So 3 points on a map. And this is a map I had seen in a psychic vision. And they're the 3 points that I lined them up. So when I found the GPS coordinate of where I was that night, camped next to the bush. I found the turnout. I found the little spot in the sand. I found the bush where the owl was. I put a little X where my sleeping pad was. And then I clicked on the yellow line on the landscape, and it bisected my sleeping pad exactly. That line was 231 miles long, stretched across between western Utah to western Colorado, and the 2 points that sure sound like UFO contact, and then a third point where I was listening to an owl and Natasha was seeing a floating orb, a UFO and owl co-joined at the spot. And at that moment, I've told this story many times, and I don't want to be cavalier about it, but in that moment, my life changed. I knew it. As soon as I saw that, it was like, this is not an accident. This is so highly orchestrated. This doesn't fall into the genre of synchronicity. This is like divine providence from the gods. I am being shown that this is not some random thing that I can dismiss. I can no longer dismiss it. My old life ended. My new life began. Now, that was March 10th, 2013. In 2018, I did a hypnosis session with Yvonne Smith in Pasadena, California. Forgive me if I'm going on too long. You just interrupt if you need to.
No, go ahead.
So I called. I knew I was traveling there. I was going to do a talk on camping at a school there, and so they hired me to. So I was like, I had a plane ticket. And I'm like, well, I'm going to be in that part of California. I should have a session with Yvonne. I had met Yvonne a few times before, and so I called her up. And I said, hey, I'm going to be in California on this date. I would love to book a session. She said, Mike, what a nice surprise. I started reading your book, The Messengers, this morning. So I was like, okay, like this, I might take this kind of stuff in stride at this point. But, here, let me back up a little bit. So these 3 dots on the map, this is something I think is important. One happened on March 10th, 2013, and the other 2 happened with my friend Natasha. So I was alone on one event, and I was with Natasha for both other events. March 10th is Natasha's birthday. To tell that story properly, I could go on for 2 hours and it would just be filled with details just like that.
So you have this, it's 2013. You have this experience, this series of experiences. Internally, you decide, you just know that you're starting a new chapter, is what it sounds like. It's just a knowingness that comes up. Undeniable. What happens next? What changes for you over the next few years? I mean, 2013, 5 years later, we have the New York Times article comes out. That must have been like pouring gasoline onto a fire for you.
I was like, I got to be really careful. I didn't really care about the New York Times thing. Like I had already had I was already like immersed in the research.
For you, this was real.
I don't need someone on a podium to disclose anything to me. So here's what happened.
No, but did it feel, I want to go back to 2013 and then kind of map the trajectory from there. But I'm just curious about this particular moment that came after, because a lot of people come into this after 2017. Mm-hmm. You were already steeped heavily in it before 2017. When 2017 happened, it felt like the whole world sort of stopped, like that scene in a movie where the record player just goes, and everybody's like, what? For you, did that did you feel a sense of maybe confirmation about the stuff that you had been feeling before, or was it sort of like, did it feel like this thing had now ratcheted up yet another step and it was going to continue to accelerate? Does that make sense? Absolutely. How I'm asking this?
Here's what it felt like. Remember, I did this. I said, I was pushing away. I was denying. I didn't want to deal with this stuff. I was seeing aliens in my yard, and I was like, no way. I was like missing time. Not me. So when I saw that yellow line on the map, I dissect the spot where I was sleeping. Like, it felt like I had spent the previous, between 2006, camping with Kristen, to 2013, the event. It wasn't the round structure on the hill. It was seeing the line on the map that connected 3 events. That was the confirmation event. So it felt like I had a tape loop in my head continually going, Mike, this can't happen. Mike, you're deluding yourself. Mike, you're crazy. Mike, this can't happen. This is impossible. You can't, it shouldn't involve you. It's not you. It can't happen. This can't happen. That tape loop had been playing ever, like unrelenting all those years. And that tape loop just got turned off, removed, tossed away, never returned. I still had plenty of challenges, plenty of issues, big questions to wrestle with, but there was without that droning voice saying, this can't happen, this can't be true, this can't be real, this cannot involve you. Once that voice was shut off, thrown away, dismissed, never came back, I could proceed forward with it with a level of clarity. It wasn't easy, it was hard work, but wow, did life get easier with that voice shut off. So that's what it was like for me.
It's the obsession that comes with this is so common. It's like that scene in Close Encounters with Richard Dreyfuss. The mashed potatoes. I mean, it's almost like a trademark of this type of experience that people just suddenly find themselves completely surrounded by it. In 2013, going back to that story where you make this connection, what happens next for you? Where does that take you?
Oh, so after 2013, I was like, So I started writing the book. I was like, I wrote 4 big fat books and dedicated myself to answering, or I got to be careful because I'm overwhelmed. There's more emails than I can possibly answer that arrive in my email inbox. So here, let me go to the session with Yvonne. So I go in and I say, I want to look at March 10th, 2013, the night under the stars in southern Utah. And the reason I want to look at that is I have no baggage for that. I loved that night. It was beautiful. It was calm. There was the coyotes. I loved that. So it was like, let's look at that night. So she said, great. So I went to her office and I sat on her couch and we talked about what we wanted to cover. And she took some notes. And then I said, hey, while I'm under, you ask me what's up with the owls. And she said, of course, no problem. So we did the session and she does this thing where she has this visualization where you walk down these steps. And as you go one step down, you're going deeper and deeper and deeper into your subconscious. Now, let me first front load this where I am very skeptical of hypnosis. I'm about to tell you a story that's really powerful, but I don't know. I cannot vouch for whether this happened, but I can say that the story has an inherent power. Like you see a movie, it's a powerful movie. You don't have to believe the movie is true, but you can be enthralled by the story of the movie. So she says, where are you? She takes me to the spot and kind of like, where are you? I'm like, well, I'm sleeping out under the stars and I've got my head's on the pillow and there's my car there and there's the big bush and my car, the stars are beautiful and it's cold. And she said, okay, what else happens? And then not much is going on. And then all of a sudden I go, it's them. It's them. I know it's them. And I'm describing the bright light behind the bush. And then then all of a sudden I go, oh, I'm out. I'm looking down at this big round structure. I'm floating above it. I'm looking down at this big round structure. And I think I'm still in the sleeping bag. And she says, Mike, are you out of body? I said, I don't know. I'm looking down at this big structure. It's clearly the big round structure. It's round. It's got a ring of lights around the edges of it. It's just black against the nighttime landscape. But I can see that this big thing and I'm floating above it. And I don't think I'm in the sleeping bag. She goes, what happens next? And then I'm walking in this hallway and it's like this curved hallway. Now to be like, if there was a big giant flying saucer and there was a round hallway that ran around the interior of it, around the edge, let's say, it felt like I was in that circular hallway. Like I would have just walked a full circle. So that's what it felt like. I don't know whether this is true or not, but this is definitely the vision I had. And I got renderings of all this stuff and drew it. And so so I immediately know I'm not tall. Like I'm 6 foot tall. And I like my instantaneous is like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I'm like, something's different. I'm short. And I say that like, I'm not tall. I say to Yvonne, I'm not tall. And she goes, look around. What do you see? And I look to my right and my left. And there's these gray beings with the big bald heads and the black eyes. And they're walking down the hall with me, right and left, out, shoulder to shoulder. We're walking kind of a lockstep. And I'm the exact same height as them. And she goes, look down at yourself. And I look down at my hands, and I got these long, skinny fingers, and I've got this tight, shiny spacesuit on, and I go, I think I'm a gray alien. And she doesn't skip a beat. This doesn't faze her at all. She just goes, what happens next? And I'm like, this feels really, I don't know how to say this feels really normal. Like I have this transcribed, and I have the recording of the session, and she goes, what happens next? And then I'm in a conference room. Now, this is a conference room with ugly beige carpeting and fluorescent lights and ugly brown wallpaper. And there's some folding tables and folding chairs. And there's these beings behind this one set of folding, like a plastic folding table, like you'd get like for $39 at Walmart. And there are these beings sitting there looking at me, and they're kind of fuzzed out, but boy, they sure, like they were the gray beings with the big bald heads, and they're all looking at me. And I'm standing there, and it feels like I'm on trial, or like I'm in a grand jury hearing, or I'm like being court-martialed or something like that. So I'm like standing there facing this thing, and I go, why am I here? And they say, you chose this. You volunteered for this. I'm like, what does that mean? And they go, now is the time. So I'm like, what does that mean? Now is the time. So they go, you chose this, and now is the time. And I get stuck with going back and forth. And then all of a sudden there is this palpable sort of snap. You can hear it in the audio recording. And I got so angry, and I started sobbing, and I was so emotional, and I was swearing. Can I swear in the show?
Sure.
Okay. So I just started. This is unbelievably difficult to listen to on the audio recording, because I'm unhinged with emotion. And I said, and I'm pointing at them, and I said, you never told me it would be this hard being here. You never told me there would be loneliness. You never told me there would be pain. You never told me there would be sadness. You never told me how hard it would be to be here in here. And they just said, you volunteered for this, and now is the time. And Yvonne is like trying to like, Mike, why are you so emotional? Mike, what is going on? What are they asking? I'm like, this is so fucked up. This is so fucked up. They don't care. They are emotionless. They don't understand what it means to be here. They don't understand what it like. Instead of like, this is some sort of fucking business deal for them, and they don't understand how hard it is to be here. And she goes, and Mike, what do they want? And I screamed, they want me to play some role. And then there's like this, you can hear me go. And I went from like freaking veins in my head, as tense as I've ever been, it's like screaming, crying, sobbing, to as calm. I felt like my heart stopped. It felt like my breathing stopped. It felt like I was like a Zen practitioner of advanced meditation. And I was completely in this realm of peace. And the recording is silent for 45 seconds. And Yvonne says, and Mike, what happens next? And I go, I think I'm back in the sleeping bag. And we talked about what may have happened and what was happening and such. And then all of a sudden, which I had asked her to say it earlier, Yvonne says, and Mike, what is your connection to owls? And without skipping a beat, I said, the owls aren't important, right? So this is 2008. Like for the previous decade, I had been like owls, answering owl emails, doing owl research, writing owl books. Owls were the most important thing. There was nothing else on my radar except owls for a decade. Mm-hmm. And I say, the owls aren't important. And then now what I'm about to say next just is going to roll off my tongue. It's only a few sentences, but it sounded different than when you do hypnosis, you're kind of whispering and there's long pauses. And I spoke very clearly, and I said, I am an artist, and I know how people take in a symbol and how we need a symbol. The owl isn't important. The owl is a symbol on a door. The owl isn't important, but it is the correct symbol for the door. We are on this side of the door in a tight, claustrophobic little hallway. And on the other side of the door is an infinite vastness. And then I kind of finished and I was like, where did that come from? So I'm going to back up and say, I cannot vouch. I don't know if this happened, but I can say that story has a power. And then that saying that the owl isn't important allowed me so much peace, because then I was like, oh, I don't have to cling to this owl thing. Mm-hmm. I can loosen up. And since then I've been much more open to just talking about the owls and death thing and talking about other aspects. And you were talking about deer. There's this wider mystery. So I'm much less clinging to the owl thing, but it is a wonderful thread to pull on. That event. So I had a hypnosis session 5 years after the event on the night of March 10th, 2013, where all this stuff came through, where it seemed like I had lived a life as one of them. I had reincarnated here on Earth with some alternate identity in me that was then being reactivated and told now is the time. That's what certainly came out of the dream. Whether that's true or not, I'm cautious to say so, but I can certainly wrap my mind around that as a story. Now, you look at the calendar. That event that we were looking at under hypnosis was March 10th, 2013. The next day I drove home. I did some drawings of the map. The next day after that, I saw the vision of the map and had my confirmation event. That would have been the 12th. The next day, I started writing the book, The Messengers. So Yvonne said, what do they want? I screamed, they want me to play some role. And the next day, I started writing the book that has come to define my life.
That's a really powerful story.
I'm very cautious to tell that one unless I can tell it completely, because you can't just tell a snippet of that one. Yeah.
Now is the time.
This is just what you were asking. Yeah. Like, are we in that time now?
But it just raises so many more questions. Is now the time for you? Is now the time for everyone? Is now the time that, what does that mean? What does that mean? What does it mean to you? I mean, obviously it led to a change in your approach to the whole phenomenon and it led to a new chapter in your life and the books that you're writing now. But have you done any further work internally on what that was all about? Or have you had other subsequent experiences that have fleshed that out for you in any other way?
Oh, I can't tell you how many people I've told this story at conferences and people come up to me afterwards and say, I have almost the same experience. Not quite to the, mine is very tidy in the sense that there's a book involved and stuff like that. But people say that experience resonates so strongly. Earlier, just at the beginning of this, I talked about being on the Zoom call with all the people. And I kind of said, like what happens is like, I have this experience where it felt like I was, and I always make sure to say, like, I don't know if this is true, but I was presented with a story that showed me as someone who had incarnated here on this reality to perform some role. Like I say that now, I recognize how ridiculous that sounds, and then to have all the people, not all the people, but many of the people kind of on the Zoom call go, yeah.
I don't think it sounds that ridiculous. I think that, just a reference again to the Jake Barber interview, he said something, Ross asked him about ontological shock. And he said, when people learn about this, will they have ontological shock? And he said, no, I think it's an ontological relief. For me, it was a relief. It was like, okay, there is another level to reality. There is another layer to this game. And now I can get on with it. I can relax now. And it sounds very similar to what you're describing here. There's a sense of like, it's almost like this is a simulation, this life. It's some kind of a game that we're in. And there's some force outside of it that can access it and give us messages, give us hints and clues to help us through the game. But we still have to play the game. We still have to do it. We have to go through all of the motions by ourselves and experience it. And your description of the human condition as sort of almost like, what a drag, what a slog, to do this. Yeah. And it just rings true. There's something about that seems very familiar. And I feel like most people have in quiet moments of contemplation probably faced that question themselves. I think we all do from time to time. Is this it? Is this all it is? Is it just Starbucks and traffic jams and suburban neighborhoods and shopping malls and buying and selling shit to each other? Is there something else? This doesn't feel like this should be it. This feels kind of like a joke, like our situation here. And there's got to be a more real reality beyond this, because I can't buy this. I don't know. Like, I just feel like I hear that from so many people. And I wonder, if what we're looking at is it a spiritual phenomenon masquerading as a physical thing, like craft and beings from another world? Or are these different things happening at the same time and we're conflating them together and trying to, we're mixing our symbology up with these other events that are happening? It's just such a big, you don't even know where to begin.
It's interesting because there's people who are doing, so there's a great big UFO continuum, right? So there's all this stuff in the UFOs. There's all kinds of evidence, from government conspiracies to like ladies in Sedona channeling, right? So, and then there's all this stuff in the middle, and I'm like myopic. Like I'm not an open-minded generalist. I am like so hyper specific on this one little thin sliver where I pull on this one tiny thread, and it's just this owl thing, which is like, I didn't discover the owl thing. Like, it was well understood in the UFO community long before I came along with this, but I'm the one who like kind of went nuts with it. But it's so within that owl story, within you pull on that thread, you have a conversation with someone, you got to turn to your buddy next to you and say, like, what does it all mean? Why are we here? Is there a God? What happens after we die? You are confronted with the biggest questions. And that's what I'm finding in this owl little thread.
It's like you said about the NDEs and contact experiences. They almost map one-to-one right on top of each other. It's so weird. And it's funny how few people really talk about that. I don't hear it discussed very much, but when people do talk about it, they talk about it as if they're almost one and the same type of experience. And I feel like for a lot of people, there's a comfort in the idea that there's a nuts and bolts reality. Like, we can go to a building, and if we go into the right room, we're going to see a real craft. And if you knock on it, it's going to make a sound. And you know what I mean? And we can go inside and sit in a chair, and I can understand that. And then, but to accept that, it also comes with this whole other reality of something beyond, something that we can't quite put into words. That's just, it's so ethereal and indescribable. I think that's where people have a lot of trouble. I think that's where some of the anxiety comes from. It's like, well, what does that? We don't know. We don't know what it means, but it means something. And maybe it's individuals having to go on their own individual path and encounter these things in their own way. And then it translates through your own personal experience. And then you arrive at the same place at the end. And we're each taking our own path to get there. I don't know.
That's the classic hero's journey. I mean, that's, everyone taking their own path. There was a quote that helped me so much early on. And this is Joseph Campbell talked about the Knights of the Round Table. And there was a myth, and he said that in the ancient Arthurian lore, all the knights had to go separately into the forest, and they had to leave the path. They had to go into the darkest part of the forest where there was no path, because you could not have an adventure on the path, on the well-worn path. And that's what it feels like to me, that the thought of stepping into the darkest part of the forest where there is no path. Like, you have to, like, there's a path that's a well-worn path, like, studying something that's made of metal, or a burn mark in the yard, or a government document that has a date, and you can talk to the control tower and ask if he had radar returns. There's these things that are pragmatic and tangible. But when you talk to the people who have had the direct experience, you are getting into the realm of the intangible and into the realm of the mystical. And how to integrate that into your day-to-day life is the challenge.
It's why the abduction phenomenon is so frustrating, I think, for a lot of people, because it straddles that line. And then between I was physically on board a craft, I have physical marks on my body, I have physical implants in my arm or my leg, or in Whitley's case in his ear. You've the physical evidence of something real and tangible, and then but no one can ever get their hands around it. There's never there's no there. It's like we're trying to grab smoke.
You're almost word for word what Mac Tonnies, I remember him saying, we would have this exact conversation, like this intangible quality. He said, there's a pool toy, this funny loopy squirty pool toy where you grab it and it shoots out of your hand. So that the UFO mystery is always one step away from being out of reach. It's very difficult to grab. Now, someone that Ross Coulthart is interviewing may have the pragmatic experience of knocking on that metal craft. I haven't had that experience, but I have had these, from my own direct experience, these dreamlike events. I mean, I would call hypnosis dreamlike. I would call the experience in the tent with Natasha dreamlike. I would call the experience of seeing the 5 beings in the backyard dreamlike, but they're not dreams. There's something else. And they have informed my life, and they have changed the way I interface with reality. They've made me do the hard work of sitting down and writing books. So I'm like, I keep on going back to the dream logic of these things, as well as like, I'm not a poet, let's say, but there is something in what the poet does where they're talking about one thing, but describing something else. So we are stuck in this physical realm. This is my strong sense. We're stuck in this physical realm, but there's something parallel to us that is much richer, much more complex, that can interact with us with ease. We can get a slight glimpse into it every once in a while, or an impression of it every once in a while, but we don't reside in that realm. We're in this physical realm. This may be temporary. After we pass through death's great door, we may have a much different idea of what may or may be going on. And that's where the near-death experience stuff has been so heartening for me, is that, it has the same flavor and mood of the UFO contact, some of the UFO contact events.
Do you think that has something to do with like the idea that you have to believe that you're going to die? Like for it to really hit home, like you've got to really believe that this is it. And there's, maybe that's necessary. That's required for the full experience to play itself out. I'm just thinking about why when you got angry in your regression and you were like, they didn't understand what this was going to be like, and that no one told me. It's almost like you have to be fully immersed in the illusion for the illusion to work on you so that you could do whatever it is.
Yeah. Oh. That's the joy of being here, is we're seduced by the smells of the forest and the songs of the birds and the drama of the pain. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I've read a lot of channeled books and stuff like that. I went through a long period of trying to make sense. Long before the UFO stuff emerged in my life, I was reading channeled books. And there's this, it paints a picture of that we are supposed to get lost in this reality. There's wonderful, joyous things that take place here, as well as challenging things. So owls and UFOs have been the gateway for me in a way. So I ask the question, why owls and UFOs? And I end up wrestling with, what does it all mean? Is there a God? What happens after we die? And I think that's how it's supposed to work. I think you could do that with anything. I think you could do that with psychedelics. I think you could do that through meditation. I think that you could do that through.
Is it like a MacGuffin? It's just pulling you through.
Perfect example.
To get you to the next thing.
Yeah. It could. I mean, so for someone else, it's deer. Someone else, for me, it's owls. For someone else, it's crystals. Yeah. It doesn't matter what the plot point is. It doesn't matter what the carrot. The kid doesn't need to be a carrot. It can be any number of things that pushes us forward.
It's the symbol on the door, but the door is you have to walk through the door. You have to find the door and then walk through it. But that's what you're doing now, in a sense.
I'll send you a picture. I could do this right now if you want. So my life fell apart in some ways, where I was during the height of COVID. I was in a relationship, and that relationship ended, and I needed a place to live, and I was kind of like staying with friends, and I finally found a place in the Seattle area. It's a really nice house, big, beautiful house, and it's really blessed to be in this. But so I'm living in this place, and on the door, this happened in like 2021. I moved in here. On the door, my bedroom door, is the wood grain panel. You can edit this out. I can send it to you if you want to see this. This is
sure. Yeah,
it's going to take just a second. I'll send you an image.
Let's see. Wow.
So that's my bedroom door. So one of them, you can see I did a little Photoshoppy little thing with it.
Yeah.
Here's a bigger one. I'm just sending you the same exact image, but it's a little bigger. So sorry again. So you tell me what you see there.
I see it. I see the owls up at the top. I see two owls, and I see two beings with big eyes underneath.
And the owls are sort of amorphically rising above them in like a ghost-like kind of, like that's how you would like.
Almost like what is that called when they photograph someone's aura?
Sure, exactly. Yeah, it's a mystical thing. Yeah, it's like
right, like
a seance photography. Yeah,
exactly. And this is on the door.
This is on my bedroom door. It's right there.
On your bedroom door
right
in this
there.
house that you wound up in.
Here, like, there it is, right there. There's my bedroom door, right there.
Wow, that is so.
The owls are a sign on the door. Like, how do I? Like, it's how to say this. Yeah, you don't like.
I know.
I mean, that's like I forget about that. It's like, oh, that's right. That is on my door.
That's what this conversation is so exciting, and I'm sorry, I'm not doing a better job of interviewing you because great. I'm just so stunned by the stories that you're telling me and how much I can relate to them, and I just don't know how to grok this right now. And
I don't think you can. I think you just got to kind of absorb it and move on. Right? I mean, what am I supposed to do? If I studied the molecular content of the wood on the door, it's not going to solve anything, right? I mean, like, I don't know how to. And it doesn't,
that's the thing. It's like every one of these little moments can be taken a number of different ways. It's almost like you're the prism through which all of this has to go. Like you're giving it meaning, you're imbuing it with meaning, but it's also meaningful in and of itself. And gosh, it's so multidimensional. It's a very strange way to experience all this stuff. I want to maybe just circle back to current events, and I just wonder if you spend much time looking at the news and pontificating on the global situation. It certainly feels to me like we're in a very precarious moment.
Anti-structure.
And that maybe, yeah, it feels like we're going through some kind of a collapse or some kind of a shift or it just feels like things are not working. And I feel like that's a sense that most people share. Everyone shares. You can see it. I see it on the road. I see people driving crazy. I see people popping off. Their temper is just, they can't control their temper. I see people in public getting into arguments from time to time. And it just feels like there's a tension that no one can really put their finger on, but it's there all the time. And I wonder for you, do you pick up on that? And do you connect that with some of this sort of increase in the UFO zeitgeist right now? This amplification of this phenomenon that we seem to be experiencing. Do those things seem connected to you?
So I listen to the news and get disillusioned just like everyone else. And my heart sinks, like we're this individually, we're creative and dynamic and we can solve problems collectively. It's not working. So I have to get up in the morning and do my best or be my best self. And I have been presented with this puzzle. There's a genuine mystery. It involves owls. It involves UFOs and a whole host of other mystical type events. And I have to proceed forward. I talk to people on the phone a lot, not enough. I should do it more. You know what? Honestly, sometimes I just feel overwhelmed. And so two things are happening. I'm overwhelmed by the number of people who are contacting me. Said, Mike, I have a powerful story I need to tell you. Can we talk on the phone? You get 5 calls, you get 5 emails like that in a day. You can realistically, you can really only contact one person, or maybe not even that. So every few days a week, I have these talks, and I am so heartened by the stories here. Let me just tell you one story. This is a short one. A guy contacts me. He has an orchard. His family has an orchard. They grow apples, and he meditates in the back of the orchard, along the edge of the orchard, and then the forest is just beyond that. So he sits and meditates. He's got this spot that he uses to meditate. So he's there one day meditating, and he hears this horrible screeching in the forest, like this horrible screeching. And then the hair on the back of his neck raises up, and he's like, gets the heebie-jeebies, and he's like, he wants to leave. He says, no, I got to figure out what this is. So he confronts his fear essentially and walks into the forest, and he walks into the forest, and there's an owl on a branch, kind of at eye level. And the owl looks right at him, and it screeches right at him. It is chewing him out. It is yelling at him. He feels like this rage is being directed at him, this emotional, like he's being chewed out by the owl. And the owl flies off, and he goes back to his family, and they're getting ready for dinner. And he tells his wife, like, oh my God, I saw this owl in the thing in the forest, and I was meditating, and the owl was looking at me, it was screeching at me, it was like chewing me out. And his wife said, that's nice, honey. Let's set the table for dinner. He's like, oh. So he sets the table, and the kids are sitting at the table, and he's like, I was just in the forest, right back by the edge of the orchard, and this owl was looking right at me, and it was screeching, and they're like, Dad. And he thinks they don't get it. So after dinner, he takes his camera and walks to the same spot, says aloud, my family doesn't believe me. I need a picture. and the owl lands on a branch. He takes a picture and the owl flies off. I got the picture. I used it in my slideshow. And then I asked, what were you meditating on? And he said, I was meditating. I was asked the question. I had an intention of that meditation, and it was, is there a God? What does this all mean? Is there meaning to my existence? I get that story, something of that power, multiple times a week. And I have for over a decade. Like, I feel like I'm at the receiving end of such powerful, beautiful stories. I am being reminded. My email inbox is as glorious as any, I don't even know how to say it. Like, a magic is just rolling in day after day after day. And I am at the receiving end of it. People say, Mike, could you write another book on owls and UFOs? I'm like, I could write 50 books. Like, it'd be all the same story though. And so, like, it's not going to do me any good to write another book unless, it's not going to do the work. Like, if you stack up my books, it's 1,000 pages of owls and UFOs. And it's not going to do any good to add another one. It's just going to tell the same story. If I can't get my point across in 1,000 pages, I don't know. It's not going to do me any good. No one's going to run. I don't know. Anyway, so I said it very clearly, and I would be repeating myself. So there is a magic folded into this that I feel all the time. And if I get disillusioned and disheartened, like, I get a magical story and I get refreshed. So
this has been one of my favorite conversations I've ever had on this subject. You have been so generous with your time. I thought we would maybe go 90 minutes or 2 hours. We're almost 3 hours into this.
Right on for us.
Is there anything else that I haven't asked you about that you want to get into before we wrap up? I have to end this soon, so I don't want to.
I wrote a novel. I when I said I ran out of, like, I wanted to address this thing. I was doing the nonfiction writing, and as I said, I would just write the same story over and over again. So I said, I gotta tackle this from a different aspect. So I wrote a novel. Here, I'm going to do this, and this is me. I'm shamelessly plugging this. So here's the book. So it's a kind of a paranormal thriller, and there's two stories. One is kind of a normal, well, it's kind of Twin Peaksy, so it has kind of a mystical events folded through it. But I was doing two things. I was trying to do so it's a UFO story where I never mention the word UFO. The UFO is not, the word UFO never shows up. Flying saucer's not in there. There's no mention of it. But there is, I was trying to address a deeper mystery, and I did that sort of below the waterline. So on the surface, it's a kind of a pop culture thriller with a romance and spies and a little action, but below that is what I would call a universal myth.
You mentioned Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks is almost the other side of the coin to this whole thing. It's almost like the UFO show that's not really a UFO show.
And it's got lots of owls in it too.
The high strangeness. Mike, where can people find out more about what you're doing? Where can they go to listen to the podcast? How can they stay up to date with your work? What's the best place?
You can go to MikeClelland.com. That's all one word, Mike Clelland, Clelland. If you can't remember that, you can Google UFOs and owls, and I'm the first thing that comes up, and then it'll take you right to that site. And from that site, MikeClelland.com, it'll take you to, there's a podcast link and a blog link and some illustration work link and audiobooks and things like that.
Outstanding. Mike, thank you so much for taking the time. I have to wrap it there, but this has been really enlightening and a lot of fun.
This was a joy. Thank you. I knew I had a great feeling. I saw you interview Kelly Chase, and I was like, I got a good feeling about this one.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I ordered your book. It's on the way. I'm going to read it, and then I would love to circle back with you again and maybe do a deeper dive into some of this stuff once I'm up to speed on everything. But this has just been a great first step, and I think it was a lot of fun. I can't wait to do it again.
Thank you so much. It's been a joy.